I am Chloe, 32 years old, and somehow still navigating the toxic web my blended family spun around me. As a highly successful clinical data manager, I tried to keep my head down and do my job, but in my family, loyalty is just another word for leverage. Last Tuesday, I was called into human resources. The director pushed a thick termination file across the desk and announced they had irrefutable proof I was working a second job on company time. My stepbrother, the vice president of compliance, leaned against the doorframe, smirking, waiting for me to break down. I did not argue. I simply smiled, signed the paper, and told them they were absolutely right. I really should focus on just one job. They had no idea my second job was a multimillion-dollar artificial intelligence firm, or that, in exactly 48 hours, they would be begging me to save their entire pharmaceutical empire from federal ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. For the past 5 years, I worked as the senior clinical data manager at Ethelgard Biosciences, one of the most powerful and ruthless pharmaceutical companies in the country. I gave that company my absolute dedication. I built their clinical trial compliance protocols from the ground up, catching catastrophic data errors that would have cost the executives millions in federal fines from the Food and Drug Administration. I thought flawless performance would secure my place in the corporate hierarchy. I was incredibly wrong. In corporate America, and especially in my blended family, loyalty only goes one direction. The fluorescent lights in the Human Resources office buzzed with a low, irritating hum that made the tension in the room feel even heavier. I sat in a stiff leather chair across from Brenda, the director of Human Resources. She was a woman who wore sharp, unforgiving suits and an even sharper expression. She never called anyone into her office for a friendly chat. But it was not Brenda who made the air in the room feel so suffocating. It was the presence of the man standing just behind her. My stepbrother Jackson Pierce was 35 years old and had just been appointed as the vice president of compliance. Jackson was the undisputed golden child of our toxic family dynamic. Growing up, my wealthy stepdad Richard and my social climbing mother Susan praised his every mediocre achievement while completely ignoring my actual successes. Jackson was loud, charismatic, and incredibly skilled at taking credit for other people's hard work. That was exactly how he had landed the vice president role just 2 months prior, heavily backed by Richard and his deep pockets and golfing connections with the Ethelgard board of directors. Brenda folded her hands perfectly on top of her pristine desk. She did not offer me a glass of water. She simply dropped a heavy manila folder directly in front of me. The sound of the thick cardboard hitting the wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. "We have irrefutable proof that you have been moonlighting," Brenda said. Her voice was completely devoid of any warmth or professional courtesy. "Operating a secondary business on company time, using company resources, is a direct violation of your employment contract and a severe breach of corporate ethics. You are terminated effective immediately." The words hung in the heavy air. I looked down at the folder. Inside were printed logs of my internet activity, showing data transfers and highly encrypted communications that they could not access, but had flagged as highly suspicious. They naturally assumed I was running some cheap part-time freelance gig on the side to make extra cash. I slowly looked up from the papers and shifted my gaze to Jackson. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his expensive tailored suit, a suit I knew for a fact was paid for by my stepdad. A smug, barely contained smirk played on his lips. He was deeply enjoying this. He was actively watching my corporate career burn to the ground. In that fleeting moment of silence, the entire picture became crystal clear to my highly analytical mind. This was not about corporate ethics at all. This was about survival, specifically Jackson and his survival. I knew for an absolute fact that Ethelgard stock had been taking a quiet beating over the past few weeks because of rumors surrounding our Phase 3 clinical trial data. The compliance department was a disaster. Jackson had recently bungled 2 major internal audits because he simply did not understand the complex clinical data software systems I had put in place. He was in way over his head, and the senior partners were starting to ask very difficult questions. With a massive federal inspection scheduled for next week, Jackson desperately needed a scapegoat. He needed a massive distraction to throw to the wolves to cover up his own declining departmental numbers and his gross negligence. By firing his own stepsister for alleged corporate theft, he would look like a ruthless, impartial leader who put the pharmaceutical company above his own family. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative public relations move. But there was another sickening layer to his betrayal. I knew the salary budget for my senior management position was significant. Jackson had been complaining for weeks about wanting to bring in his old college fraternity brother, a guy who had zero biotech compliance experience but was great at organizing executive golf outings. By terminating me today, Jackson freed up exactly the amount of money he needed to hire his incompetent friend. He was literally sacrificing my livelihood to fund his personal social circle at the office. My heart beat steadily against my ribs, not with panic, but with profound disbelief. This was the man I had grown up with, the stepbrother I had covered for when we were rebellious teenagers, the man whose massive structural mistakes I had been secretly patching every single night just to keep the Food and Drug Administration from shutting down our clinical trials. And here he was standing tall in a sterile office, watching a human resources director strip away my health insurance and my stable income without a single ounce of visible remorse. He fully expected me to cry. I could see it in the way he tilted his head, waiting eagerly for the tears to fall. He expected me to plead for my job, to beg Brenda for a second chance, to ask him to intervene on my behalf as my family member. He wanted to feel incredibly powerful. He wanted to watch me break into pieces. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool oxygen fill my lungs and calm my mind. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my favorite pen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of panicked defense. I leaned forward, opened the folder to the final page containing the harsh termination agreement, and signed my name in smooth, steady ink. Brenda blinked rapidly, clearly taken aback by my absolute lack of resistance. She had been prepared for a massive fight armed with corporate policies and legal threats. My total serene compliance threw her completely off her practiced balance. I closed the folder and slid it back across the mahogany desk. Then I stood up gracefully, smoothing the wrinkles from my professional skirt. I looked directly into Jackson's eyes. The triumphant smirk on his face faltered slightly, suddenly replaced by a brief flicker of genuine confusion. "You are right," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly level, and entirely devoid of fear. I really should focus on just one job. Jackson scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as he pushed himself off the doorframe. He foolishly thought my words were an admission of pathetic defeat. He thought I was trying to save face, pretending that being suddenly fired was somehow a welcome relief. He thought he had won the war. What Jackson and Brenda absolutely failed to realize was that they had not just fired a senior clinical data manager. They had just severed their only viable lifeline. They had no idea that my unauthorized side hustle was not some insignificant freelance project. They did not know that the encrypted data transfers they had flagged were actually vital security patches keeping Ethelgard Biosciences from completely collapsing under federal scrutiny. They wanted me gone, and I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. But I knew something they did not. I knew that the ticking time bomb sitting in their server room had just been activated, and I was the only person on Earth holding the deactivation code. I turned my back on them and walked confidently out of the office, completely ready to face whatever came next. The heavy glass doors of the Human Resources Department clicked shut behind me. 2 security guards in dark gray uniforms fell into step on either side of my shoulders. They were standard procedure for any immediate termination at Ethelgard, meant to intimidate the fired employee and ensure they did not steal any sensitive physical documents on their way out of the building. I knew both of the guards by name. I did not hold their presence against them. They were just doing their jobs in a corporate environment that fed on fear. The elevator ride down to the ground floor was agonizingly slow. I watched the digital floor numbers count down from the 40th floor, feeling a strange sense of detachment. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I adjusted the strap of my leather purse on my shoulder and kept my chin raised. When the polished metal doors finally slid open to reveal the expansive main lobby, a few junior analysts paused by the reception desk to watch my escorted exit. Whispers rippled through the open space. In a matter of hours, the internal company chat channels would be flooded with wild rumors about my sudden departure. I walked through the revolving doors and stepped out into the damp morning. The rain had intensified, washing the gray sidewalks of the corporate campus. The security guard stopped at the edge of the company property line, nodding awkwardly before turning back inside. I pulled my coat tighter around my waist and began the short walk across the sprawling executive parking lot. My car was parked near the back, surrounded by the sleek imported sports cars favored by the senior partners. The rain pattered against my umbrella, creating a rhythmic drumming sound that matched my steady footsteps. I was just reaching for my car keys when I heard the sharp, urgent sound of leather dress shoes splashing through the shallow puddles behind me. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who was aggressively closing the distance between us. Jackson had not been satisfied with merely watching me sign the termination paperwork. He needed the final visceral thrill of physically throwing me off his territory. I unlocked my car doors with a soft beep and slowly turned around. Jackson was practically jogging across the wet asphalt, ignoring the rain that was currently ruining his perfectly styled hair and expensive suit. In his hands, he carried a flimsy brown cardboard box filled with the meager personal belongings I had kept on my desk. He reached my car breathing heavily, his face flushed with a mixture of exertion and residual adrenaline from his orchestrated power play. He did not gently hand the box over. Instead, he shoved it forcefully onto the wet hood of my sedan. The cardboard scraped loudly against the paint, and the impact sent a few loose pens and a small notebook tumbling over the side and into a muddy puddle near my front tire. I looked at the spilled items, then calmly shifted my gaze back to his face. He had completely dropped his polished corporate facade. The polite, concerned executive act he had put on for the human resources director was gone, replaced by the ugly, arrogant sneer I had known since we were teenagers. "Do not expect my father or your mother to bail you out this time, Chloe," he sneered, his voice loud enough to echo across the empty parking spaces. "You are completely on your own. You have always been an absolute embarrassment to this family name, and today you finally proved it to the entire executive board. You could not even handle a simple data management job without slacking off and breaking company policy." I stood perfectly still, letting his cruel words wash over me like the cold rain. He desperately wanted me to argue. He wanted me to shout, to defend my work ethic, to beg for his sympathy. When I remained silent, his frustration visibly mounted. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me. "By the way," he said, his tone shifting from insulting to purely transactional, "I need the encryption passwords for your clinical trial databases. The system locked me out when Human Resources deactivated your employee profile 10 minutes ago. Write them down right now and leave them with me, or I swear I will have the corporate legal team sue you for theft of company property and deliberate sabotage." I looked at him, truly registering the sheer depth of his incompetence. He had orchestrated my firing without securing the basic administrative transition protocols. He had blindly assumed he could just bully me into handing over the keys to the kingdom in the parking lot. The clinical trial databases contained all the historical compliance data, including the glaring catastrophic risk assessment failures he had personally buried over the last 2 months. He needed those files to hide his tracks before the federal regulators arrived for their scheduled preliminary review next week. My reaction was not one of panic or submission. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that cut sharply through the sound of the falling rain. Jackson recoiled slightly, clearly caught off guard by my amusement. "Sue me?" I repeated, shaking my head slowly. "Just like you threatened to sue me when I refused to empty my personal savings account to cover your massive offshore cryptocurrency losses last year." His face instantly drained of color. His jaw tightened so hard I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had buried that financial disaster deep, relying on my silence to maintain his pristine image with our parents and his snobby wife. I stepped around him, picking up the damp cardboard box from the hood of my car and placing it carefully onto the passenger seat. I opened the driver door and turned back to face him one last time. "You really should read the federal guidelines before you fire the only person managing them, Jackson," I said, my voice completely stripped of any familial warmth. "Those legacy databases do not belong to Ethelgard Biosciences anymore. They were migrated to a secure third-party vendor network last Friday as part of the new compliance mandate. You have zero administrative authority to access them without my direct authorization, and I no longer work here. Good luck cracking a military-grade firewall before the federal review begins Thursday morning." I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the sound of his furious, sputtering response. Through the rain-slicked window, I watched his face contort with a sudden dawning panic. He slammed his hand against the wet trunk of my car as I started the engine, but I did not look back again. I shifted the gears smoothly, pulling out of the parking space and leaving him standing completely alone in the freezing downpour. As I drove away, my cell phone buzzed in the center console, the screen illuminated with a text message from my mother demanding my presence at a mandatory family dinner. Jackson was already spinning his web of lies, but he had no idea the trap he just set was meant entirely for him. I looked away from the ridiculous termination papers and focused my attention entirely on Jackson. He was standing there trying to project absolute authority, wearing a tailored Tom Ford suit that I knew for a fact was purchased with my stepfather Richard and his endless credit limit. Jackson always dressed like a man who had earned his wealth, completely ignoring the reality that he was entirely dependent on family handouts. But looking at him now, I saw right through the expensive fabric and the arrogant posture. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together in my mind with cold precision. This sudden termination had absolutely nothing to do with corporate ethics or a secondary business. I monitored the internal data flows every single day. I knew exactly what was happening behind the locked doors of the executive suites. Ethelgard Biosciences stock was quietly plunging. The Phase 3 clinical trial data for our flagship cardiovascular drug was riddled with catastrophic anomalies, and Jackson, as the Vice President of Compliance, was entirely responsible for securing that data. The problem was that Jackson did not understand a single line of code in the advanced tracking software I had built to keep the company compliant. I was completely blind to the impending disaster. With the federal inspectors from the Food and Drug Administration scheduled to arrive next week, Jackson was suffocating under the pressure. He needed two things immediately. First, he needed a convenient scapegoat to take the brutal fall when the federal agents inevitably discovered the corrupted trial data. Firing his own stepsister for alleged sabotage was the perfect cover story to hide his own gross negligence. Second, he desperately needed my substantial senior management salary. He had been loudly complaining for weeks about wanting to hire his old college drinking buddy to fill a vacant director role, a guy who knew absolutely nothing about biotech compliance but excelled at securing exclusive golf course reservations. By throwing me out of the building today, Jackson secured his scapegoat and freed up the exact budget he needed to bring his incompetent friend onto the payroll. He was sacrificing my entire career to buy himself a temporary shield, genuinely believing I was too weak to fight back. Jackson stood leaning against the doorframe, eagerly waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He fully expected me to burst into tears right there in the Human Resources office. I could see it in the way he tilted his chin, that predatory anticipation of watching me beg Brenda for my job or plead with him to remember that we were family. He wanted the visceral thrill of watching me crumble under the weight of his manufactured authority. I did not give him a single drop of that satisfaction. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not offer a single word of panicked defense. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and uncomfortable for everyone except me. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs and calm my pulse. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my own pen. I leaned forward over the mahogany desk, opened the heavy manila folder to the final page containing the harsh termination agreement, and signed my name in smooth, steady ink. Brenda blinked rapidly, her sharp corporate facade slipping for a fraction of a second. She was completely taken aback by my absolute lack of resistance. She had been prepared for a massive fight armed with legal threats and company policies. My total serene compliance threw her entirely off balance. I closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. I stood up gracefully and smoothed the wrinkles from my professional skirt. I looked directly into Jackson's eyes, letting a faint, pleasant smile touch my lips. The triumphant smirk on his face faltered slightly, suddenly replaced by a brief flicker of genuine confusion. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice incredibly calm, perfectly level, and completely devoid of fear. "I really should focus on just one job." The heavy glass doors of the Human Resources Department clicked shut behind me. Two security guards in dark gray uniforms immediately fell into step on either side of my shoulders. They were standard procedure for any immediate termination at Ethelgard Biosciences. Their presence was meant to intimidate the fired employee and ensure that no sensitive physical documents were stolen on the way out of the building. I knew both of the guards by name. I had actually helped one of them navigate a complicated health insurance claim just 3 months ago. He refused to meet my eyes, now staring straight ahead as we walked down the long carpeted corridor toward the executive elevators. I did not hold his silence against him. He was just doing his job, and in a corporate environment, as ruthless as this one self-preservation always came first. The elevator ride down to the ground floor was agonizingly slow. The soft instrumental music playing from the hidden speakers felt almost mocking in its tranquility. I watched the digital floor numbers count down from the 40th floor, feeling a strange and powerful sense of detachment. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I adjusted the strap of my leather purse on my shoulder and kept my chin raised. When the polished metal doors finally slid open to reveal the expansive main lobby, a few junior analysts paused by the reception desk to watch my escorted exit. Whispers rippled through the open space. In a matter of hours, the internal company chat channels would be flooded with wild rumors about my sudden departure. I walked through the revolving doors and stepped out into the damp morning. A cold gray drizzle had settled over the city, washing the concrete sidewalks and leaving a sharp metallic scent in the chilly air. I took a deep breath, letting the cold moisture settle into my lungs. The security guards stopped at the edge of the company property line. They nodded awkwardly before turning back inside to the warmth of the grand corporate lobby. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my waist and began the short walk across the sprawling executive parking lot. My modest sedan was parked near the back, completely surrounded by the sleek imported sports cars and luxury utility vehicles favored by the senior partners. The rain pattered lightly against the asphalt, creating a rhythmic drumming sound that matched my steady, deliberate footsteps. I was just reaching into my purse for my car keys when I heard the sharp, urgent sound of leather dress shoes splashing through the shallow puddles behind me. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who was aggressively closing the distance between us. Jackson had not been satisfied with merely watching me sign the termination paperwork in the warmth of the Human Resources office. He needed the final visceral thrill of physically throwing me off his territory. He wanted to make sure I felt the full crushing weight of his unearned authority. I unlocked my car doors with a soft beep and slowly turned around. Jackson was practically jogging across the wet pavement. He completely ignored the freezing drizzle that was currently ruining his perfectly styled hair and his expensive suit. In his hands, he carried a flimsy brown cardboard box filled with the meager personal belongings I had kept on my desk. He reached my car breathing heavily, his face flushed with a mixture of physical exertion and the residual adrenaline from his orchestrated power play. He did not gently hand the box over to me. Instead, he raised it high and shoved it forcefully onto the wet hood of my sedan. The wet cardboard scraped loudly against the paint, and the violent impact sent a few loose pens and a small notebook tumbling over the side and into a muddy puddle near my front tire. I looked down at the spilled items, watching the ink on my notebook pages begin to run in the rain. Then I calmly shifted my gaze back to his face. He had completely dropped his polished corporate facade. The polite, concerned brother act he had put on for the human resources director was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly, arrogant sneer I had known since we were teenagers living under the same roof. But beneath that sneer, I saw something else. I saw the frantic, barely contained terror vibrating in his eyes. "Do not expect my father or your mother to bail you out this time," he sneered, his voice loud enough to echo across the empty parking spaces. "You are completely on your own. You have always been an absolute embarrassment to this family name, and today you finally proved it to the entire executive board. You could not even handle a simple data management job without slacking off and breaking company policy." I stood perfectly still, letting his cruel words wash over me like the cold rain. He desperately wanted me to argue. He wanted me to shout to defend my work ethic, to beg for his sympathy, or to start crying right there in the parking lot. When I remained entirely silent, his frustration visibly mounted. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me. "By the way," he said, his tone shifting abruptly from insulting to purely transactional, "I need the encryption passwords for your clinical trial databases. The system locked me out when Human Resources deactivated your employee profile 10 minutes ago. Write them down right now and leave them with me. If you refuse, I swear I will have the corporate legal team sue you for theft of company property and deliberate sabotage." I looked at him, truly registering the sheer, breathtaking depth of his incompetence. He had orchestrated my immediate firing without securing the basic administrative transition protocols. He had blindly assumed he could just bully me into handing over the keys to the kingdom in the parking lot. The clinical trial databases contained all the historical compliance data for the last 5 years, including the glaring catastrophic risk assessment failures he had personally buried over the last 2 months. He needed those files to hide his tracks before the federal regulators from the Food and Drug Administration arrived for their scheduled preliminary review next week. I was standing in the freezing rain demanding access to the very system he had just fired me for maintaining. He thought he could separate my labor from my authority. He thought he owned both. My reaction was not one of panic or submission. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that cut sharply through the sound of the falling rain. Jackson recoiled slightly, clearly caught off guard by my amusement. His eyes darted around the empty parking lot as if checking to see if anyone else was witnessing his humiliation. "Trimmy," I repeated, shaking my head slowly. "Just like you threatened to sue me when I refused to empty my personal savings account to cover your massive offshore cryptocurrency losses last year." His face instantly drained of color. His jaw tightened so hard I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He had buried that financial disaster deep, relying on my silence to maintain his pristine image with our parents and his incredibly snobby wife. He thought that secret gave him leverage over me, assuming I would always play the role of the quiet, dependable sister who fixed his constant mistakes. I stepped around him, picking up the damp cardboard box from the hood of my car and placing it carefully onto the passenger seat. I opened the driver door and turned back to face him one last time. The rain was matting his hair to his forehead, making him look less like a powerful corporate vice president and more like a lost, angry child. "You really should read the federal guidelines before you fire the only person managing them," Jackson, I said. My voice was completely stripped of any familial warmth or professional courtesy. Those legacy databases do not belong to Ethelgard Biosciences anymore. They were migrated to a secure third-party vendor network last Friday as part of the new compliance mandate. You have zero administrative authority to access them without my direct authorization. And since you just had human resources permanently deactivate my profile, I no longer have the legal authority to grant you access, even if I wanted to. You cut your own cord. I paused, letting the devastating reality of his own foolish actions sink into his panicked mind. "Good luck cracking a military-grade firewall before the federal review begins Thursday morning," I added smoothly. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the sound of his furious, sputtering response. Through the rain-slicked window, I watched his face contort with a sudden dawning panic. The arrogant sneer finally collapsed, replaced by the sheer terror of a man who realized he had just locked himself inside a burning building. He slammed his hand against the wet trunk of my car as I started the engine, but I did not look back again. I shifted the gears smoothly, pulling out of the parking space and leaving him standing completely alone in the freezing downpour. I drove for several long blocks, allowing the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers to clear my thoughts. The harsh reality of his betrayal was painful, yet incredibly liberating. For my entire life, I had dutifully played the role of the quiet, dependable sister who fixed his constant mistakes. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to protect his fragile ego and maintain the illusion of family harmony. But today, that incredibly destructive cycle was permanently and finally broken. I took one very slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' unrealistic expectations completely lift off my weary shoulders. I was no longer their scapegoat, and I was finally entirely free. I drove for another 10 minutes until the towering glass structures of the corporate campus gave way to the quieter, tree-lined streets of the surrounding neighborhoods. The rain continued to fall in steady, rhythmic sheets against my windshield, creating a comforting barrier between myself and the corporate world I had just left behind. I pulled my sedan into a vacant parking space along a brick-paved avenue, shifted the gear into park, and turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the cabin was profound. I sat there for a long moment, my hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel, listening to the gentle drumming of the rain. My phone buzzed persistently in the center console. I did not need to look at the screen to know it was Jackson. He was likely panicking in the lobby right now, realizing the catastrophic mistake he had just made by firing the only person who understood the deeply flawed architecture of his compliance department. I reached over and flipped the phone face down, let him panic. Then a different notification tone chimed. I picked the phone back up and glanced at the lock screen. It was not Jackson. It was a text message from my mother, Susan. It was short, demanding, and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. It stated that my presence was required at a mandatory family dinner tonight at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I knew exactly what that meant. Jackson had already called them. He was already spinning his pathetic web of lies, trying to manipulate the narrative before I could even get home. But he had absolutely no idea that the trap he thought he was setting for me was actually the very thing that would destroy him. Jackson slammed his hand flat against the wet hood of my car, completely ignoring the freezing rain that was currently soaking the sleeves of his expensive suit. He leaned in close, his face twisted in a mix of desperate rage and sheer panic. He accused me of deliberately sabotaging the clinical trials. He loudly threatened to call the corporate legal team the moment he walked back inside the building. He swore he would have them file federal charges against me for theft of corporate property, digital extortion, and cyber terrorism. He actually believed he could terrify me into submission. He genuinely thought the hollow threat of a massive lawsuit would break my composure and force me to hand over the encryption keys to his failing compliance network. I stood there in the chilling drizzle, looking at him with a profound, almost clinical sense of pity. He was the vice president of compliance for a massive pharmaceutical empire, yet he had absolutely no idea how the federal regulations actually functioned. He had spent his entire tenure attending lavish lunches, playing golf with senior partners, and taking credit for my flawless quarterly reports, completely ignoring the complex software architecture I was building every single night just to keep him out of federal prison. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or rush my words. I spoke slowly and clearly, ensuring every single syllable pierced directly through his arrogant delusion. I told him he really needed to read the new federal guidelines before he unceremoniously fired the only person actively managing them. I watched his eyes narrow in confusion as I calmly explained the reality of his situation. I told him that the legacy clinical databases did not belong to Ethelgard Biosciences anymore. They were no longer sitting on our vulnerable internal corporate servers. In strict accordance with the new federal mandate regarding patient data security, the entire system had been fully migrated to a highly secure third-party cloud server late last Friday night. The remaining color rapidly drained from his face as the technical reality of my words slowly registered in his brain. I continued breaking down his catastrophic mistake with surgical precision. I explained that access to that third-party cloud server was strictly regulated by federal law. Only active authorized compliance personnel could request an entry portal. It was a closed-loop system entirely dependent on a verified active employee profile. I watched his arrogant facade completely shatter into a million jagged pieces. I pointed out the absolute breathtaking irony of his orchestrated power play. I told him that by dragging me into the Human Resources office this morning and by forcing Brenda to immediately and permanently deactivate my employee credentials, he had legally and digitally severed his only point of access. He had blindly assumed the passwords were just simple text codes written on a sticky note in my desk drawer. He lacked the technical vocabulary to understand that they were biometric role-based credentials tied directly to my active employment status. I could not give him the passwords even if I wanted to. My administrative profile simply did not exist anymore. I offered him a cold, detached smile that contained absolutely no familial warmth. I told him he had just locked himself outside of his own burning building, and he had personally thrown away the only key. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut with a solid, heavy thud. The sound instantly cut off Jackson and his furious, sputtering response. Through the rain-slicked window, I watched his face contort with a sudden dawning panic. The arrogant sneer finally collapsed. It was replaced by the sheer terror of a man who realized he had just locked himself inside a burning building and personally thrown away the only key. He slammed his hand against the wet trunk of my car as I started the engine, but I did not look back again. I shifted the gears smoothly. I pulled out of the parking space and left him standing completely alone in the freezing downpour. I drove for several long blocks, allowing the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers to clear my thoughts. The harsh reality of his betrayal was painful yet incredibly liberating. For my entire life, I had dutifully played the role of the quiet, dependable sister who fixed his constant mistakes. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to protect his fragile ego and maintain the illusion of family harmony. But today, that incredibly destructive cycle was permanently and finally broken. I took one very slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my family and their unrealistic expectations completely lift off my weary shoulders. I was no longer their scapegoat, and I was finally entirely free. I drove for another 10 minutes until the towering glass structures of the corporate campus gave way to the quieter, tree-lined streets of the surrounding Manhattan neighborhoods. The cold rain continued to fall in steady, rhythmic sheets against my windshield. It created a comforting barrier between myself and the toxic corporate world I had just left behind. I pulled my sedan into a vacant parking space along a brick-paved avenue. I shifted the gear into park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the cabin was profound. I sat there for a long moment, with my hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel, just listening to the gentle drumming of the rain. Then my brief moment of peace was violently shattered. My cell phone vibrated aggressively against the plastic of the center console. It was a sharp, continuous pulse that demanded immediate attention. I reached over and picked up the device. The screen illuminated the dim cabin of my car. It was not a desperate apology from Jackson. It was a text message from my biological mother, Susan. I unlocked the screen and read the brief notification. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if Jackson had treated me fairly during the termination. Her message carried the brisk, cold authority of a royal summons. It read, "Family dinner tonight at the steakhouse at 7 sharp. Do not be late. We have incredibly important things to discuss regarding your completely unacceptable behavior today." I read the harsh words twice. The complete absence of maternal concern was almost impressive. Jackson had obviously called my mother before the security guards had even escorted me through the grand corporate lobby. He would have described himself as the brave executive forced to discipline an unstable relative. He would have completely omitted the failing federal audits, the inaccessible cloud databases, and his aggressive parking lot demand that I surrender my credentials. Susan and my wealthy stepfather Richard would not have asked for a single shred of proof. They never did when their golden child offered them a version of events that preserved his status as the family hero. A second message appeared on the screen before I even had the chance to respond. It read, "Your stepfather reserved the private booth. Jackson has had a very difficult day. Do not make this worse." I almost laughed out loud in the quiet car. Jackson had fired me. He had threatened me in a wet parking lot, and he tried to force me to help conceal his massive corporate negligence. Yet according to my mother, he was the one who needed emotional protection. The toxic pattern was so disgustingly familiar that I could predict the entire dinner down to the very last detail. They would demand an apology and the database passwords. If I resisted, they would loudly accuse me of jealousy and extreme disloyalty. The only difference was that this time, I was not walking into the restaurant hoping to be loved or understood. I was walking in with total, absolute power. I typed a simple reply saying I will be there at 7. Then I dropped the phone back into the console and started the engine. The real game was just beginning. The high-end Manhattan steakhouse was suffocatingly loud, filled with the steady hum of corporate dinners, clinking crystal wine glasses, and the rich, heavy scent of seared beef and expensive truffles. It was exactly the kind of restaurant my wealthy stepfather Richard always selected when he wanted strangers to notice his perceived importance. Dark wood panels, brass lamps, pristine white tablecloths, and a wine list designed specifically to turn deep insecurity into a 4-figure bill. When I arrived, the hostess led me toward a massive curved leather booth at the very rear of the dining room. I heard the sharp manufactured laughter of my sister-in-law Maya long before I even saw the table. My family was already seated, and they were already raising their expensive crystal glasses in a celebratory toast. A bottle of imported red wine sat in a sweating silver cooler beside them, and a second completely unopened bottle waited on the service stand. Jackson had changed out of the rain-spotted suit he wore in the parking lot and into a crisp navy jacket with a silk pocket square. He looked entirely restored and polished, perfectly convinced that the family tribunal would return me to his complete control. Sitting right next to him was his wife, Maya. Maya was a stunning African-American woman who had built a very lucrative career as a luxury real estate agent for the Manhattan elite. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored designer dress that hugged her frame, and her hair was styled to absolute perfection. Maya had always possessed an incredibly intense superiority complex. She spent her days selling multimillion-dollar penthouses to billionaires, and she frequently made it very clear that she considered my corporate data management job to be pathetic and strictly middle class. My mother, Susan, and my stepfather Richard sat across from them, acting like the proud presiding judges of a private court. No one stood to greet me. No one asked how I was doing after being brutally fired that morning. Susan merely looked at her diamond watch and sighed loudly. "You are 5 minutes late, Chloe," my mother stated. Her tone was laced with profound disappointment. "Traffic," I replied smoothly, sliding into the empty side of the leather booth. A waiter immediately appeared with a leather-bound menu, but Richard waved him away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "We already ordered for you," Richard announced. "You always take far too long deciding." Of course they had. Even the meal placed in front of me had been chosen entirely without my consent. I removed my wool coat, folded it neatly beside me, and surveyed the table. Richard lifted his wine glass higher, demanding the attention of the entire table. To Jackson, he announced, his booming voice loud enough for the neighboring booths to hear clearly. A real corporate leader who actually had the courage to protect Ethelgard Biosciences from internal liabilities today, even when the difficult decision involved terminating family. Susan touched her glass to his with an enthusiastic smile, and to the bold restructuring that will finally let his compliance department reach its true potential. Jackson accepted the sickening praise with a modest smile so carefully performed that it would have been completely convincing to anyone who had not watched him throw a cardboard box onto a wet car hood just a few hours earlier. That was when Maya decided it was her turn to strike. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished mahogany table. As she moved, the ambient restaurant lighting caught the massive, blindingly bright new diamond ring sitting on her left hand. It was easily a 5-carat stone, and she made sure my eyes landed directly on it. "We are just so incredibly proud of him," Maya purred, taking a slow, delicate sip of her wine. "Jackson is literally carrying that entire pharmaceutical corporation on his back right now. He is making massive executive decisions while dealing with total incompetence from his subordinates." She paused, turning her sharp, beautifully manicured gaze directly toward me. Her eyes were filled with absolute, unadulterated disdain. "And then there is you, Chloe," Maya continued, her voice dripping with venom. "Jackson told us everything about your little human resources meeting today. It is honestly just pathetic. Jackson is out there securing the financial future of this family, and you got yourself fired because you were too busy playing around with petty information technology projects on company time. You jeopardized his department for a cheap freelance side gig. When are you finally going to grow up and get your life together?" I looked across the table at the woman who was currently wearing a diamond ring purchased with money her husband had likely embezzled from his own employer. She was so incredibly arrogant, so completely blinded by her obsession with status and wealth, that she could not even see the massive federal investigation speeding directly toward her husband. Susan nodded eagerly, completely agreeing with Maya and her cruel assessment. "Your sister-in-law is absolutely right, Chloe. You are 32 years old. You have no job, no prospects, and clearly no sense of basic loyalty to the people who raised you. We brought you to this dinner hoping you would finally show some genuine remorse." Richard set his steak knife down on his porcelain plate. He wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin and leaned forward, resting his broad shoulders against the table. He possessed the exact same arrogant posture as Jackson, a physical trait my stepbrother had perfectly mimicked over 3 decades. "Your mother is right, Chloe," my stepfather said, his voice dropping into that condescending, authoritative tone he reserved exclusively for me. "Jackson was put in a very difficult position today. You forced his hand. A vice president cannot have junior staff members undermining his authority. It looks terrible to the board of directors. Now stop being so incredibly stubborn and uncooperative. Give him whatever computer passwords he needs right now so he can properly restructure his department. You have already caused enough trouble for him today." I looked at the 4 of them sitting on the opposite side of the table, a unified, impenetrable wall of toxic family dynamics. They genuinely believed they held all the power in this room. They thought they could bully me in a crowded restaurant using their combined disapproval, and Maya and her vicious insults to force me into handing over the keys to the legacy system. They had absolutely no idea that the legacy system was currently locked behind a military-grade firewall built by my own hands. They did not know that without those passwords, Jackson was completely unable to hide the massive compliance violations he had committed over the past 60 days. He did not want to restructure his department. He wanted to cover up his own tracks before the Food and Drug Administration review team arrived, and he was using our parents and his snobby wife to pressure me into facilitating his criminal cover-up. I did not shrink back into my leather seat. I did not apologize for my supposed failures, and I certainly did not defend my highly successful artificial intelligence firm to people who would never understand it. I picked up my heavy silver fork, pierced a perfectly cooked piece of asparagus, and took a slow, deliberate bite. I chewed my food in total serene silence, letting their cruel words hang suspended in the heavy restaurant air. I did not need to defend my reality to them. The truth was already in motion, speeding toward them like a massive freight train in the dark. I was merely sitting at the table, patiently waiting for the inevitable impact. Susan leaned closer to the center of the table. Her eyes were wide with manufactured outrage. "You are an incredibly ungrateful child, Chloe," she hissed across the table. "After everything Richard has done for you, he paid for your college tuition. He allowed you to live under his roof. He treated you like his own daughter, and this is how you repay our generosity. You humiliate your brother at the office, and then you sit here acting like you are the victim. You are biting the hand that feeds you." Richard slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany table. The heavy silverware rattled loudly against the fine porcelain plates. "Do not ignore your mother when she is speaking to you," he commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that used to terrify me when I was a teenager. "You owe this family everything you have. You will write down those administrative passwords right now. You will hand them over to Jackson, and you will apologize for your completely unacceptable behavior today." Jackson sat back in his plush leather seat, letting our parents do his dirty work. He watched me with eager anticipation, expecting the combined weight of their toxic disapproval to finally break my spirit. He desperately needed those database keys to hide the clinical trial failures before the federal inspectors arrived, and he was perfectly happy to let his mother and stepfather emotionally abuse me to get them. I looked at the four of them. I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no shame, no lingering desire to scream and defend my character. I picked up my heavy silver steak knife and my fork. I carefully sliced a perfectly uniform piece of the medium-rare ribeye that had been ordered for me without my consent. I placed the meat in my mouth and chewed it slowly. The steak was incredibly tender and rich. I swallowed my food and took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal glass. The sheer desperation radiating from their side of the booth was palpable. They were throwing every toxic manipulation tactic they possessed at me: guilt-tripping, intimidation, name-calling. They expected me to crumble just like I always did when I was younger. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply enjoying a highly expensive dinner while watching them unknowingly dig their own financial and legal graves. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate, rested my hands in my lap, and simply stared back at them in total serene silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that had settled over our side of the leather booth was finally broken by the crisp, professional voice of our waiter. He appeared at the edge of the table, expertly balancing a small silver tray. He poured more expensive imported red wine into Richard and Jackson empty crystal glasses. Maya held out her glass as well, flashing her massive diamond ring under the warm, ambient restaurant lighting. She leaned against Jackson's shoulder and let out a soft, condescending laugh. "It is just so hard to comprehend, Chloe," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Jackson is sitting right here dealing with massive federal regulations and preparing for the Food and Drug Administration inspectors. He is doing the work of 3 executives. And you threw away a perfectly good data management job because you wanted to play around on the internet. You have absolutely no ambition. You have no drive. I honestly do not know how Jackson shares the same genetics with you." She took a slow sip of her wine, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. Susan nodded along with her daughter-in-law, completely validating the vicious insult. Richard simply grunted in agreement, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. They were all so incredibly comfortable in their shared delusion. They genuinely believed they were the elite upper echelon of Manhattan society, and they viewed me as a pathetic failure who was dragging down their pristine family name. I did not argue with Maya. I did not point out that she was a real estate agent who married into money while I was actively building complex artificial intelligence algorithms. I simply let her bask in her manufactured superiority. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my heavy leather purse. I unzipped the main compartment, fully intending to drop a $20 bill on the table to cover my sparkling water and walk out of their toxic lives forever. Just as my fingers brushed against the smooth leather of my wallet, my personal cell phone vibrated violently at the bottom of my purse. It was not a standard gentle buzz indicating a random text message or a social media notification. It was a sharp, aggressive, continuous pulse. It felt like a frantic heartbeat against my fingertips. I recognized that specific vibration pattern immediately. It was the emergency override alert from my primary banking application. A deep frown formed on my face for just a fraction of a second before I quickly smoothed my expression back into total serene indifference. I pulled the phone out of my purse and brought it up to the edge of the table, keeping the screen carefully angled away from the prying eyes of my family. I pressed my thumb against the biometric sensor on the screen. The device unlocked instantly, and the display flared to life in the dim restaurant lighting. My breathing completely stopped. The entire interface of my highly secure banking application was washed in a brilliant, urgent red color. A massive warning banner completely dominated the display. Critical fraud alert. Please verify immediate origination of commercial funds. I stared at the bold white text, my highly analytical mind racing through my immediate financial architecture. My credit was absolutely pristine, carefully guarded behind multiple layers of institutional security. I had zero debt. I owned a massive artificial intelligence firm hidden behind a blind trust. There was absolutely no reason for my primary bank to issue a critical fraud alert. I tapped the secure link on the screen to open the detailed transaction report. My eyes rapidly scanned the raw data as it populated on the glowing display. A massive commercial mortgage loan had just been fully approved and completely drawn. The amount listed in bold red font was absolutely staggering: $400,000. I felt a sudden icy chill radiate down my spine, spreading rapidly through my chest and pooling heavily in my stomach. $400,000 had just been legally attached to my identity. I scrolled down further, dissecting the origination details with cold surgical precision. The loan had been secured using my exact social security number, my verified birth date, and my historical residential data. The lender was a prominent national bank that was well known for expedited commercial lending. But the most damning and terrifying piece of information was the routing destination. The massive sum of money had not been transferred into any of my secure personal accounts. It had been instantly routed to an external joint account. I recognized the last 4 digits of that routing number immediately. It was a legacy account. It was an old joint financial checking account my mother and stepfather had set up for me when I was an 18-year-old girl heading off to my first year of college. I had stopped using it over a decade ago, assuming it had been closed and purged from the banking system. But Susan and Richard had remained on that account as primary co-signers. The heavy, suffocating puzzle pieces began to snap together in my mind with terrifying, violent clarity. I looked up from the glowing red screen of my phone and stared directly at Jackson. He was currently sipping his martini, laughing at some cruel joke Maya had just whispered in his ear. Jackson had not just been failing at his job as the vice president of compliance. He had not just been hiding routine data errors from the federal inspectors. A corporate executive does not suddenly need $400,000 in immediate liquid cash unless they are trying to cover up something deeply criminally illegal. My mind connected the dots with brutal efficiency. I knew Jackson was obsessed with projecting wealth. I knew he traded heavily on margin accounts. The stock for Ethelgard Biosciences had been quietly plummeting for weeks because the Phase 3 clinical trial data was corrupted. Jackson must have leveraged his own assets, or worse, he had embezzled corporate funds to cover his massive margin calls when the stock started crashing. He had created a massive, gaping financial hole, and with the federal review team arriving next week, he was entirely out of time. His own personal credit was undoubtedly destroyed from his offshore cryptocurrency gambling addictions. He could not secure a legitimate commercial loan to save his own life, so he had gone to our parents. He had gone to Richard, and Susan spun a tragic, desperate story and begged them to save his career and his freedom. And my parents, who had spent their entire lives shielding their golden boy from the consequences of his own disastrous actions, had willingly crossed the line into a severe federal crime. They had used the personal identifying information they held from my childhood. They had weaponized my pristine credit score. They had forged my digital signature as a hidden guarantor, and they had bypassed the standard underwriting process because my financial data practically guaranteed immediate approval. They had taken out a massive fraudulent loan to bail out their favorite child. They had not just fired me this morning, they had financially ruined me to fund my stepbrother and his corporate crimes. The sheer absolute magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket of lead. They were sitting right across the mahogany table from me, eating expensive steaks and sipping imported wine. They were casually demanding that I apologize to Jackson, all while knowing they had just stolen $400,000 in my name. Suddenly, a sickening realization washed over me. I looked around the crowded luxury steakhouse. I looked at the appetizers, the expensive wine, the private leather booth. This entire dinner was a setup. They had orchestrated this mandatory family gathering, not just to humiliate me, but to keep me physically distracted and away from my computer while the fraudulent funds cleared the external routing process. They wanted me sitting right in front of them, docile and submissive, while the final banking approvals went through the automated system. I looked at my stepfather, Richard. He had placed his expensive smartphone face up right next to his half-empty wine glass. He always did that as a subtle power move to show everyone that his business was more important than his family. At that exact moment, the sleek screen of his phone illuminated the dim space between us. A push notification slid smoothly across his lock screen. I did not need to lean forward or strain my eyes to read the bold text. The message was a direct confirmation from the exact same national bank that had just issued my critical fraud alert. The notification proudly announced that a commercial wire transfer of $400,000 had been successfully completed and deposited into the legacy joint account. I watched Richard glance down at the screen. A look of profound, undeniable relief washed over his aging features. He let out a long, slow breath, subtly relaxing his broad shoulders against the leather booth. He actually reached out under the table and patted my mother gently on the knee. It was a silent, triumphant signal between co-conspirators that their massive financial crime had just cleared the final institutional hurdle. They had done it. They had successfully stolen my identity to bail out Jackson, and they were sitting across from me, basking in the warm glow of their own perceived brilliance. Maya noticed the shift in Richard's posture and smiled brightly. "See, Richard," she chirped, her voice echoing loudly. "Everything always works out for people who actually work hard. Jackson is going to have a brilliant quarter." I looked at Maya, feeling a deep, clinical sense of pity for her willful ignorance. She was wearing a 5-carat diamond ring and bragging about her husband while sitting at a table with 3 people who had just committed wire fraud and identity theft to keep her illusion of wealth alive. The absolute audacity of the situation was almost difficult to comprehend. My family had spent my entire life telling me I was a foolish, lazy disappointment. They had completely isolated me emotionally, constantly comparing my quiet data management career to Jackson and his flashy corporate titles. And yet when the walls were finally closing in on their golden child, they did not hesitate to completely destroy my future, to buy him a few more days of freedom. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan did not make me want to cry. It did not make me want to scream or throw my crystal glass across the crowded restaurant. It made me feel an intense, overwhelming sense of calm clarity. The emotional tether that had bound me to this family for 32 years instantly completely snapped. There was no more guilt. There was no more obligation. There was only the cold, hard reality that I was sitting at a table with federal criminals. They had finally handed me the exact ammunition I needed to sever these toxic ties permanently. They thought they had trapped me. They thought I was just a mid-level clinical data manager who would spend years trying to untangle a ruined credit score while Jackson walked away completely free. They had absolutely no idea that I possessed the digital infrastructure to freeze their entire world with a single keystroke. I slowly zipped my purse closed. I kept my phone firmly in my hand, my thumb resting gently on the biometric sensor. I looked at the 4 of them laughing and drinking their imported wine, completely oblivious to the massive storm that was about to obliterate their entire existence. The sweet revenge was beginning right now, and I was going to ensure that absolutely nothing survived the fallout. The pieces of this disgusting puzzle locked together in my mind with brutal efficiency. This entire orchestrated nightmare was never just about a simple corporate termination. My highly analytical mind began running the financial calculations, and the reality of Jackson and his desperate situation became undeniably clear. Jackson was a man obsessed with projecting an image of limitless wealth. I knew he actively traded on highly leveraged margin accounts, trying to multiply his lifestyle. But over the past few weeks, the stock price of Ethelgard Biosciences had been quietly bleeding out because the Phase 3 clinical trial data was completely corrupted. When the stock price plummeted, Jackson was inevitably hit with massive margin calls by his brokers. He had to produce liquid cash immediately to cover his reckless bets. But Jackson was already drowning in his own fabricated lifestyle. He did not have the cash, so he did the only thing an arrogant, desperate executive would do. He began siphoning money directly from the corporate compliance budget. He actively embezzled company funds to cover his personal trading losses. But he had finally run out of money to steal. With the federal inspectors from the Food and Drug Administration arriving next week, the gaping hole in his departmental ledger would be discovered instantly. He was completely out of time and he was completely out of cash. His own personal credit was entirely destroyed. No legitimate banking institution would ever hand him a massive commercial loan, so he ran crying to our parents. He went to Richard and Susan, and he begged them to save him from federal prison. Richard and Susan were wealthy on paper, but all their money was tied up in real estate and illiquid assets. Selling anything quickly would alert their social circle to their financial distress, and my mother would rather die than face public humiliation at her country club. So they looked for another solution. They looked at me. They looked at my perfectly unblemished, pristine credit profile. They looked at my spotless financial history, and they saw the perfect emergency parachute for their golden boy. They secretly weaponized my Social Security number and bypassed standard underwriting because my data guaranteed immediate approval. And then I realized the most sickening part of their entire scheme. I looked around the crowded high-end restaurant. I looked at the expensive wine and the heavy leather booth. This mandatory family dinner was not just an opportunity for Maya and my mother to humiliate me. It was a calculated physical trap. They had orchestrated this lavish meal to keep me entirely distracted. They needed me away from my secure home network and my computers. They wanted me sitting right here, docile, submissive, and completely occupied by their toxic arguments, while the automated banking system finalized the underwriting. They intentionally kept me trapped in this booth so I would not notice the digital alerts until the massive sum of money was successfully dispersed into their account. They were holding me hostage in plain sight while they robbed my financial future. The ambient noise of the busy Manhattan steakhouse seemed to fade into a distant, meaningless hum. I did not scream. I did not throw my crystal glass across the mahogany table. I did not give Maya the satisfaction of watching me break down and cry in the middle of a crowded restaurant. Instead, I felt an intense, overwhelming sense of absolute calm. The emotional chains that had held me to this toxic family for my entire life simply dissolved into nothing. I reached into the small side pocket of my leather purse. I did not pull out my platinum credit card to pay for their lavish celebration. I extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I extended my arm and placed the paper currency deliberately in the exact center of the polished table, right next to Richard and his expensive smartphone. Susan snapped at me, her voice laced with sudden sharp irritation. She demanded to know what exactly I was doing and ordered me to stop making a scene. I ignored her completely. I looked directly into Richard's eyes. My voice was incredibly low, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. "I am paying for my sparkling water," I stated smoothly. "I am absolutely not funding a celebration dedicated to my own termination, and I am certainly not funding a criminal cover-up." Richard flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to deliver one of his trademark authoritarian lectures about respect and family duty. But before he could form a single word, I raised my hand and pointed a perfectly steady finger directly at his phone. "You really should turn off your push notifications," Richard, I said, keeping my gaze locked firmly on his face. "Especially when you are actively committing a federal financial crime right across the dinner table from your victim." The air in our booth completely vanished. Richard froze his mouth, hanging slightly open. His eyes darted down to his phone screen and then snapped rapidly back to me. The color drained from his flushed cheeks with terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Susan let out a sharp theatrical gasp, bringing her manicured hand up to cover her mouth in sheer panic. Maya completely stopped smiling. The arrogant superiority vanished from her beautiful face as her eyes darted frantically between her husband and her father-in-law, trying to comprehend what I had just said. Jackson practically choked on his martini, slamming his crystal glass down onto the table as he stared at me in total horror. They realized in that exact split second that I knew everything. I knew about the embezzled funds. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the $400,000 fraudulent commercial loan they had just taken out in my name. I did not wait for their pathetic excuses. I did not stay to listen to their desperate lies or their inevitable attempts to manipulate me into keeping quiet. I grabbed my wool coat and stood up gracefully, smoothing my skirt. I looked down at the four of them one last time. Stripped of their manufactured authority, they looked small, frantic, and entirely pathetic. I turned on my heel and walked purposefully out of the restaurant, leaving them suffocating in the silence of their own destruction. The moment the crisp night air hit my face outside the restaurant, I pulled my cell phone back out. I opened the highly secure portal to my primary banking application, which was directly linked to the national credit bureaus. I navigated to my personal financial profile and firmly pressed the command to initiate a total credit freeze. A bright warning prompt appeared on my screen, formally asking me to confirm the critical action. The system noted clearly that this would instantly halt and recall any pending financial transactions currently attached to my verified identity. I did not hesitate for a single passing second. I confirmed the freeze. The advanced banking system processed my encrypted command instantly. Because the $400,000 commercial loan was still in a pending wire transfer state, the sudden total lockdown of my credit profile triggered an immediate aggressive reversal protocol. The massive influx of cash they were desperately depending on to cover Jackson and his hidden embezzlement was vaporized by a single tap of my thumb. But the institutional response did not stop there. The banking system recognized the severe discrepancy between the frozen credit profile and the unauthorized loan origination. The National Bank automatically red-flagged the fraudulent loan and instantly flagged the destination account belonging to Richard and Susan. Their legacy joint account was now frozen pending a massive federal fraud investigation for suspected identity theft and wire fraud. The financial death spiral was now completely irrevocably locked in. My family had wagered their entire pristine upper-class existence on the absolute certainty that I would remain docile and submissive. They bet everything they owned on my silence, and they had ultimately lost. The drive away from the luxury steakhouse was remarkably peaceful. I had fully expected a massive wave of residual anxiety to wash over me. For my entire life, standing up to my mother and my stepfather had resulted in crushing guilt and days of emotional turmoil. They had meticulously programmed me to believe that setting a basic boundary was an act of profound selfishness. But as I navigated my sedan through the slick, rain-swept streets of Manhattan, I realized the guilt was completely absent. They had crossed a line so severe and so undeniably criminal that it had instantly severed the toxic emotional tether that had bound me to them for 32 years. I did not drive back to the modest middle-class apartment my family assumed I rented in the suburbs. I drove toward the most exclusive residential district in the city. I pulled my car into the secure underground parking garage of a towering, ultra-luxury high-rise building. A uniformed concierge recognized me immediately and offered a polite nod as I bypassed the main lobby and walked directly to the private resident elevators. My home was a sprawling, modern penthouse loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. It was a massive architectural masterpiece that I had purchased in cash entirely with the quiet, massive profits from my artificial intelligence firm. It was a space my family had never visited and would never know existed. They believed I was barely scraping by on a data manager's salary. Their utter contempt for my career had given me the ultimate privacy, and that privacy had allowed Omnistat Solutions to grow into a tech unicorn without my stepbrother ever trying to attach his arrogant name to it. I walked inside and dropped my keys on the black granite kitchen island. I did not bother turning on the main living room lights. I walked straight down the long hallway to my private home office. The large room was bathed in the soft blue ambient light of my custom multi-monitor workstation. This was the true nerve center of my existence. I placed my leather purse on a chair and sat down at the expansive glass desk. I reached out and touched the main control panel. The entire workstation hummed to life. I did not use a standard commercial operating system. I placed my thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the glass and looked directly into the retinal camera. The system verified my biological signature in a fraction of a second. The screens flared to a brilliant crisp white, bypassing standard interfaces entirely. "Welcome to Omnistat Solutions." The greeting materialized across the center monitor in elegant minimalist text. This was the massive secret that my family would have relentlessly mocked if they had ever known about its early infancy. 4 years ago, while my parents were busy funding the lavish lifestyle of my stepbrother and looking the other way when he made terrible financial choices, I was spending every single evening and weekend writing thousands of lines of complex machine learning code. Working at Ethelgard Biosciences had given me a front-row seat to the massive vulnerabilities within the pharmaceutical sector. I saw firsthand how incompetent executives were constantly exposing their clinical trials to catastrophic federal fines due to sheer arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern compliance regulations. I had built Omnistat Solutions to fix the exact problems they were actively ignoring. I registered the company under a completely blind trust. I operated the entire business through anonymous proxy servers and retained a formidable team of elite legal representatives who were strictly bound by the absolute tightest non-disclosure agreements legally possible. To the outside corporate world, the founder and chief executive officer of Omnistat Solutions was a brilliant, reclusive tech visionary who refused to do press interviews. To my family, I was just Chloe, the disappointing daughter who wasted her time staring at a computer screen. I opened my primary command dashboard. The interface was a breathtakingly complex array of global data streams and active compliance monitors. But I was not logging in to check on my global clients tonight. I navigated away from the main monitoring hub and opened a highly encrypted backdoor portal that I had legally integrated into the Ethelgard Biosciences network infrastructure. The situation had escalated dramatically since I had checked it in the parking lot that morning. The warning indicators on the Ethelgard grid were no longer just flashing yellow. A cascading series of critical red alerts was rapidly spreading like a digital virus across their entire internal clinical trial network. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the beautiful, chaotic destruction unfold across my high-definition monitors. When Jackson and the Human Resources Director officially deactivated my employee profile, they did not just revoke my email access. They instantly terminated the silent, automated background patches I had been running every single day. Without my software actively masking their massive data vulnerabilities, their legacy system was literally bleeding secure information. Jackson had effectively dismantled his own corporate fortress. He had spent the last 2 months intentionally burying adverse reaction reports from the Phase 3 cardiovascular drug trials to keep the stock price artificially inflated. I had built a temporary legal sandbox to quarantine those corrupted files, giving the Medical Review Board time to analyze them before they hit the federal servers. But Jackson fired me. The sandbox collapsed. Now the raw, highly corrupted clinical trial data was completely exposed to the automated compliance pingers. I watched the live diagnostic map as the internal Ethelgard servers began to desperately attempt to reconcile the massive data discrepancies. The system was failing entirely. The red indicators multiplied by the second. The pharmaceutical company was currently hemorrhaging secure patient data and violating dozens of major federal masking regulations with every passing minute. But the most devastating part of the collapse was happening completely outside of Jackson and his control. Ethelgard was legally bound by strict automated reporting thresholds. If their clinical data showed severe anomalies, the system was hardwired to send emergency notifications directly to the federal databases. I watched in total serene silence as the automated reporting protocols triggered. Massive packets of corrupted data and hidden adverse medical reactions were currently being transmitted directly to the servers at the Food and Drug Administration. The federal regulators were receiving an unfiltered real-time view of Jackson and his gross negligence. I opened a secondary monitor to view the internal corporate server traffic at Ethelgard. The sheer panic radiating from their digital footprint was palpable. Their internal technology team had opened dozens of priority incident tickets, but the technicians were completely locked out of the compliance architecture. No one in that building possessed the security clearance or the technical vocabulary to even understand the alarms going off in their own server room. I could clearly see the digital signature of the chief executive officer logging into the emergency response channel. He was likely screaming at his technical team right now, demanding to know why the compliance network was melting down on the eve of a major federal inspection. The internal communication servers were overloaded with frantic messages between the senior partners and the legal department. Jackson had confidently told his board of directors that his department was running perfectly. He had proudly handed them my head on a silver platter to prove his decisive leadership. Now those same directors were watching their multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire collapse into a massive federal compliance disaster, and all the digital forensic trails pointed directly back to the vice president of compliance. I sat alone in my luxurious penthouse, listening to the soft hum of my servers and watching the red lights paint my office walls. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. Jackson had built this trap entirely by himself. He had provided the materials, he had tied the knot, he had placed his own neck securely inside the noose. All I did was stop holding the rope. The digital lock was now permanently turned. The federal authorities were already receiving the damning data, and the absolute corporate ruin of my arrogant stepbrother was officially in motion. I took a slow sip of water from a glass on my desk and simply waited for the inevitable desperation to reach my anonymous inbox. The soft blue glow of my monitors suddenly shifted as a high-priority alert bypassed my standard communication filters. I navigated my cursor to the highly secure inbox dedicated exclusively to Omnistat Solutions corporate correspondence. It was a heavily encrypted email sent directly from the private server of the Chief Executive Officer of Ethelgard Biosciences. I clicked the secure link and opened the message, letting my eyes scan the frantic text. The tone of the communication was completely devoid of the usual polished corporate arrogance. It was a message born from absolute unadulterated desperation. The chief executive officer was actively begging the anonymous founder of Omnistat Solutions for an immediate digital lifeline. The carefully constructed professional facade had entirely collapsed. He explained that their internal clinical data systems were experiencing a catastrophic failure that was cascading across their entire global network. He openly admitted that the federal review team from the Food and Drug Administration was scheduled to arrive in less than a week, and without the immediate deployment of our proprietary compliance algorithms, the pharmaceutical company would face massive federal indictments and total ruin. Then I reached the financial offer located at the very bottom of the frantic message. The chief executive officer was not simply asking for a temporary software license or a consulting contract. He was proposing a complete expedited acquisition of the Omnistat compliance platform. The number printed on my screen in bold black text was absolutely staggering: $60 million in immediate liquid capital. He promised to authorize the wire transfer of the funds by tomorrow morning if I would simply remotely activate the compliance patches and stop the massive data hemorrhage. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and stared at the glowing screen. $60 million was an incredible amount of money. It was the kind of generational wealth that could buy absolute freedom for 10 lifetimes. But as I watched the red warning lights continuing to flash across the Ethelgard network map, I felt absolutely no temptation to reply. My silence was currently worth far more than their desperate money. If I accepted the lucrative offer and patched their crumbling system, I would be giving my stepbrother exactly what he desperately needed. I would be instantly saving his career and allowing him to walk away from his gross negligence and his active embezzlement without facing a single legal consequence. I had not spent the last 4 years building a massive digital empire in the shadows just to bail out the toxic family that had spent my entire life trying to mentally and financially destroy me. I moved my cursor over the frantic message and deliberately clicked the archive button without typing a single word in response. I did not send a polite professional refusal. I did not send a calculated counteroffer. I chose absolute complete silence. I knew exactly how that deafening silence would echo inside the Ethelgard executive boardroom. When the chief executive officer realized that Omnistat Solutions was completely ignoring his frantic multimillion-dollar pleas, the initial panic would rapidly escalate into pure, unchecked corporate terror. The executive team would suddenly realize that there was no magic technological fix coming to save them. With no external software available to mask the massive clinical trial violations, the board of directors would desperately search for someone to blame for the catastrophic internal failure. They would inevitably look directly at the vice president of compliance. They would summon Jackson. I pictured Jackson sitting in the luxury steakhouse, completely unaware of the digital apocalypse unfolding at his office. By tomorrow morning, he would be standing in front of a furious board of directors. He had no administrative passwords. He possessed absolutely no technical knowledge regarding the complex systems I had built. He had zero ability to stop the automated federal reporting protocols from exposing his massive trail of fraud. He was completely defenseless. I closed the encrypted email interface and turned my attention back to the live server map. The red indicators were multiplying rapidly as more corrupted data spilled into the federal regulatory servers. I took another slow, deliberate sip of water and simply watched the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company continue to burn to the ground. The next 48 hours were an absolute masterpiece of corporate self-destruction. I sat alone in my dark, luxurious penthouse, bathed entirely in the cool blue light of my massive multi-monitor workstation. I barely slept, but I did not feel a single trace of fatigue. I was far too captivated by the digital apocalypse unfolding across my screens. The total silence from Omnistat Solutions had worked exactly as I had calculated. By completely ignoring the frantic multi-million-dollar acquisition offer from the chief executive officer, I had pushed the entire executive board of Ethelgard Biosciences into a state of total unchecked terror. I monitored their internal corporate communications through the secure backdoor portal I had legally integrated into their architecture years ago. The internal network was a chaotic mess of priority red flags and automated panic protocols. The chief executive officer had realized very quickly that no magical software company was going to swoop in and save them from the pending federal inspection. He desperately needed a scapegoat to offer the federal authorities. He needed someone to take the massive legal fall for the corrupted clinical trial data. The digital meeting logs from Tuesday afternoon told the entire pathetic story. The chief executive officer had summoned Jackson into the main executive boardroom. I could see the exact duration of the meeting, and I could read the immediate aftermath in the internal chat channels of the legal department. Jackson had been cornered. He had tried to blame the data hemorrhage on junior staff members. He had undoubtedly tried to blame me since he had so proudly fired me just a few days prior. But the internal system logs did not lie. Every single catastrophic compliance failure and every single missing file pointed directly back to the administrative credentials belonging to the vice president of compliance. The chief executive officer had given Jackson a brutal and completely unyielding ultimatum. Jackson was ordered to secure a functional software contract with Omnistat Solutions before 10 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. If he failed to deploy the compliance patches by that exact deadline, his employment would be immediately terminated with absolute prejudice. Furthermore, the corporate legal team was instructed to prepare a comprehensive dossier of his gross negligence and hand it directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation the moment the deadline passed. It was now Wednesday night. The Thursday morning deadline was less than 12 hours away. Jackson was completely out of time, completely out of stolen money, and completely out of options. He was trapped like a desperate rat on a rapidly sinking ship. That was the exact moment a new high-priority notification chimed quietly across my primary monitor. The alert did not come from the official corporate domain of the chief executive officer. It was routed through an encrypted external server utilizing a masked private email address. The encryption attempt was incredibly amateur. My automated security algorithms bypassed the masking protocol and verified the true origin of the sender in less than 4 seconds. The email was from Jackson. I was using a private secure network from his luxury townhouse, undoubtedly hiding in his home office while his oblivious wife Maya slept in the next room. He had absolutely no idea that he was writing directly to the very same sister he had humiliated and fired. He genuinely believed he was reaching out to a faceless, untouchable tech billionaire who founded Omnistat Solutions. I opened the message and began to read. The email was a frantic, rambling disaster. It was completely devoid of any standard corporate etiquette or professional polish. The subject line was entirely blank. The opening sentence was a desperate plea directed to the primary decision-maker of the software firm. Jackson explained his situation using thinly veiled hypotheticals that fooled absolutely no one. He stated that he was a senior executive at a major pharmaceutical firm facing an immediate critical deadline. He admitted that his internal clinical data was severely corrupted and that a federal review team was arriving on Friday. He was explicitly asking a third-party software vendor to provide a customized digital patch that would actively hide the adverse medical reactions from the federal government. He was begging a complete stranger to help him falsify federal health records. But Jackson did not stop there. The crushing weight of the Thursday morning deadline pushed him into a realm of sheer criminal stupidity that even I found genuinely breathtaking. I knew that the chief executive officer had already offered $60 million for the software. Jackson had no authority to increase that official corporate offer, so he proposed a different arrangement entirely. He offered a deeply illegal secondary transaction. He explicitly wrote down a proposal for a massive financial kickback. I leaned closer to my high-definition monitor, my eyes scanning the text in pure disbelief. Jackson stated that if Omnistat Solutions would quietly provide the software patch directly to him before the 10 o'clock deadline, he would manipulate the internal procurement system at Ethelgard. He promised to authorize an additional $5 million consulting fee on top of the original acquisition price. But the $5 million was not meant for the software company. Jackson clearly outlined a massive money laundering scheme. He instructed that the secondary consulting fee must be routed to a specific external offshore shell company. He wrote that the shell company would retain $2 million for his own personal use, and the remaining $3 million would be quietly routed back to the Omnistat founders as an untraceable cash bonus. He actually typed out the full legal name of the offshore shell company. He provided the exact international banking routing numbers, the unique SWIFT codes, and the private account identifiers for a financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. He promised that the transaction would be completely invisible to the federal regulators and that they could both walk away incredibly wealthy. I sat in the soft blue glow of my office and read the email 3 separate times. The sheer absolute magnitude of his foolishness was almost difficult to comprehend. Just a few days ago, Jackson was sitting in a high-end Manhattan steakhouse, drinking imported martinis and wearing a tailored navy suit. He had looked at me with total arrogant superiority, while our parents secretly stole $400,000 in my name to fund his lavish lifestyle. He genuinely believed he was a master manipulator, an elite corporate titan who could outsmart the entire world. And now here he was on his knees in a digital inbox crying and begging for his life. He was so entirely blinded by his own panic that he had forgotten the single most fundamental rule of corporate survival. You never put your financial crimes in a written document. Jackson had just handed me a verified signed confession. He had clearly documented his undeniable intent to commit corporate fraud, money laundering, and federal bribery. By offering a kickback and providing the exact details of his offshore accounts, he had unwittingly given me the final missing piece of the puzzle. I no longer needed to spend hours hacking into his encrypted personal finances to prove he was embezzling money. He had just voluntarily handed me the exact name of the shell company he was using to hide his stolen corporate funds. This single email was a massive, undeniable murder weapon. It was all the proof the Federal Bureau of Investigation would ever need to lock him inside a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I slowly moved my hand to my computer mouse. I did not type a single word in response. I did not acknowledge his pathetic attempt at bribery, and I certainly did not accept his desperate offer. Instead, I executed a secure command to download the entire unedited email, complete with the verified server routing data and the digital timestamps. I saved the file onto a highly encrypted external hard drive. I looked at the digital clock displayed in the corner of my monitor. It was nearly midnight. The Thursday morning deadline was rapidly approaching. Jackson was currently sitting in his expensive townhouse, staring at his computer screen, sweating and praying for a reply that was never going to come. He would spend the entire night refreshing his inbox, watching his entire fabricated life slowly evaporate into nothing. I closed the email interface and locked my workstation. I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. I had built the digital fortress. Jackson had chosen to attack it, and in doing so, he had completely destroyed himself. The trap was now permanently bolted shut. When the sun came up and the clock struck 10, the absolute destruction of my arrogant stepbrother would no longer be just a calculated possibility. It would be an unavoidable, spectacular reality. I did not keep this massive digital weapon to myself. While Jackson sat in his luxury townhouse desperately refreshing his inbox, I opened a highly secure direct communication channel to Evelyn. Evelyn was the chief legal counsel for Omnistat Solutions. She was a brilliant, absolutely ruthless corporate attorney who had spent a decade dismantling corrupt executives before I hired her to protect my proprietary algorithms. I attached the unedited file containing Jackson and his frantic bribery attempt and sent it across the encrypted network. Evelyn confirmed receipt of the digital package within 60 seconds. I did not need to explain the sheer magnitude of what she was looking at. As an elite attorney, she instantly recognized that Jackson had just provided a verified signed confession to multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted bribery of a corporate entity. Evelyn initiated a forensic lockdown protocol immediately. She archived the complete digital footprint, preserving the server routing data and the international banking codes in a tamper-proof legal vault. The evidence was now officially completely indestructible, ready to be handed directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission the exact moment I gave the command. With the legal trap securely bolted into place, it was finally time to end my strategic silence. I shifted my attention away from Jackson and his pathetic personal inbox. I opened the primary corporate communication thread, where the chief executive officer of Ethelgard Biosciences and the entire board of directors had been relentlessly pleading for their corporate lives for the past 48 hours. Their last message had offered $60 million and a desperate apology for their crumbling clinical infrastructure. They were expecting a massive software contract. They were expecting a complex digital download link and a set of automated compliance patches to magically fix their gross negligence before the federal inspectors arrived. They were going to receive something entirely different. I rested my fingers on my illuminated keyboard. I did not draft a lengthy professional response. I did not negotiate their multimillion-dollar acquisition offer, and I completely ignored their pathetic excuses regarding their catastrophic network failure. I typed a single, terrifyingly brief mandate. I informed them that the chief executive officer and founder of Omnistat Solutions would personally arrive at the Ethelgard Biosciences primary executive boardroom at precisely 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I stated that the massive acquisition offer would be addressed in person, but I attached one strictly non-negotiable condition to my arrival. I explicitly demanded that the entire active board of directors must be seated in that room, and I required the mandatory physical presence of the Vice President of Compliance, Jackson Pierce. I did not offer any further explanation. I did not sign the message with my actual name. I simply attached the official Omnistat corporate seal to the bottom of the brief text and pressed send. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched the delivery confirmation flash across my primary monitor. The message had successfully bypassed their internal firewall and landed directly in the secure inbox of every single senior partner and board member at the pharmaceutical company. I could perfectly envision the absolute chaos that single email was about to ignite inside their corporate headquarters. The board of directors would be instantly thrown into a state of frantic, panicked preparation. The mysterious, untouchable billionaire who held the key to their entire corporate survival was finally descending from the digital clouds to meet them in person. They would spend the entire night scrubbing the boardroom, preparing the financial ledgers, and frantically trying to figure out why the tech founder specifically requested the presence of their wildly incompetent compliance officer. And Jackson would be summoned once again. The chief executive officer would likely call him in the middle of the night, screaming at him to put on his best suit and prepare for the most important meeting of his life. Jackson would undoubtedly believe that his desperate anonymous bribery email had actually worked. He would genuinely think that the mysterious billionaire was coming to finalize his massive money laundering scheme and save him from federal prison. His massive, arrogant ego would convince him that he had successfully manipulated his way out of total destruction yet again. He would walk into that executive boardroom tomorrow morning perfectly polished and completely convinced of his own manufactured brilliance. He would stand next to the board of directors waiting to shake the hand of the brilliant software developer who was about to make him incredibly rich. He had absolutely no idea that the brilliant executive walking through those heavy mahogany doors was going to be the exact same sister he had humiliated, abused, and fired just 3 days ago. I powered down my secondary monitors, letting the soft blue ambient light in my office fade into total darkness. The digital warfare was officially over. Tomorrow morning, the real execution would begin. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ethelgard Biosciences executive boardroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany table. It was exactly 9:55 in the morning. The atmosphere inside the massive room was so incredibly tense, it felt as though the air itself had been pulled from the space. The entire active board of directors was present, just as I had demanded. 12 of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential pharmaceutical executives in Manhattan were sitting in their ergonomic leather chairs, sweating through their expensive, tailored suits. At the head of the table, the chief executive officer paced back and forth across the thick Persian rug. His face was a sickly pale gray. He had spent the entire night watching the internal compliance network completely collapse. He knew that the federal inspectors from the Food and Drug Administration were preparing their indictments at this very moment. He held his smartphone in his trembling hand, obsessively checking the time every 10 seconds. He was a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on ruthless intimidation and corporate bullying, and yet right now he was entirely at the mercy of a faceless software developer he had never even met. But there was one person in the room who did not look panicked at all. Jackson Pierce sat directly to the right of the chief executive officer, occupying the seat traditionally reserved for the second in command. He was leaning back in his high-backed leather chair, completely relaxed. His posture was a perfect physical manifestation of unearned arrogance. He was wearing a brand-new custom-tailored charcoal gray suit with a subtle pinstripe, a crisp white silk shirt, and a solid burgundy tie. His hair was perfectly styled, and his gold watch caught the morning light every time he adjusted his cuffs. While the board of directors stared down at their legal pads in sheer terror, Jackson was actually smiling. It was that same sickening, arrogant smirk he wore at the high-end steakhouse when he watched my parents steal my identity to fund his massive financial crimes. He looked around the boardroom with supreme confidence, entirely convinced that his digital bribery attempt from the night before had been a spectacular success. Jackson gently tapped his expensive gold pen against the mahogany table to draw the attention of the frantic executives. He cleared his throat loudly, projecting his voice to ensure everyone in the massive room could hear his manufactured confidence. "You really need to calm down, Richard," he said, addressing the chief executive officer by his first name. It was a massive breach of standard corporate hierarchy, but Jackson clearly felt he had earned the right to act like an equal. "I told you already that I have this entire situation completely under control. There is absolutely no reason for everyone to look so incredibly miserable." The chief executive officer stopped pacing and glared at my stepbrother. His eyes were bloodshot from a total lack of sleep. "How exactly do you know that, Jackson?" he demanded, his voice trembling with exhausted rage. "We are currently hemorrhaging critical patient data to the federal government. The founder of Omnistat Solutions demanded our physical presence today without confirming a single detail of the $60 million acquisition. We are flying completely blind into the most important meeting in the history of this pharmaceutical company." Jackson let out a low, condescending laugh. He sat forward and rested his elbows on the polished table, lacing his fingers together in a textbook display of manufactured authority. "We are not flying blind," he stated smoothly. "You might be in the dark, but I have been actively communicating with the Omnistat leadership team all night. I opened a private back-channel dialogue with their chief executive officer late yesterday evening. I knew standard corporate emails were not going to cut through the noise, so I took the initiative to reach out directly." A murmur of desperate hope rippled down the long mahogany table. The board of directors leaned in, hanging on to every single word my stepbrother was saying. They were terrified men looking for a savior, and Jackson was perfectly happy to play the role. Jackson puffed out his chest, his ego swelling to fill the massive room. We had a very productive, very high-level discussion. He continued spinning his web of absolute lies with practiced ease. "The Omnistat founder is a very pragmatic visionary. We speak the exact same language. I explained our current compliance data issues using highly technical parameters that, quite frankly, most of you would not fully understand. I made it very clear that Ethelgard Biosciences is a premier partner, and I negotiated the framework for a complete systemic patch." The chief executive officer let out a long, shaky breath. "You are absolutely certain they are going to deploy the software today?" he asked, his voice laced with desperate vulnerability. "I am 100% certain," Jackson replied, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. "I personally closed the deal at midnight. The founder respects aggressive, decisive leadership, and that is exactly what I delivered. He is coming here this morning specifically because I invited him to finalize the logistics of our partnership. I even managed to negotiate a highly favorable secondary consulting structure that will benefit our internal procurement numbers." It was a breathtaking display of pathological lying. Jackson was actually sitting in front of the entire board of directors, taking full public credit for a meeting he did not arrange and a software patch he had entirely failed to secure. He was twisting his pathetic, desperate attempt at federal bribery and money laundering into a heroic tale of late-night corporate negotiation. He genuinely believed that the anonymous billionaire was coming to the office to collect the $3 million offshore kickback and that the remaining $2 million would be quietly routed into his Cayman Islands shell company by the end of the day. Jackson looked down the table at the senior partners, his chest puffed out with undeniable pride. "When this meeting concludes and our compliance servers are fully restored, I expect a formal review of my compensation package," he announced boldly. "I think I have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that my strategic value to this corporation goes far beyond my current title as vice president. I saved this company last night, and I expect to be recognized for that achievement." Several of the desperate board members actually nodded in agreement. They were so blinded by their fear of federal prison that they were willing to give Jackson anything he wanted if it meant the Omnistat algorithms would mask their corrupted clinical data. "You just get that software running on our servers," Jackson, the chief executive officer, said, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "If that billionaire walks in here and deploys the compliance patch before the federal inspectors arrive tomorrow, you can have whatever executive title and bonus structure you want." Jackson smiled, his eyes gleaming with absolute unchecked greed. "Consider it done," he promised confidently. "I know exactly how to handle people like him." Outside the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom, I stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway, listening to every single word. I had arrived at the Ethelgard corporate headquarters 15 minutes early, completely avoiding the main reception desk. I used my old active key card, the one Jackson and Human Resources had stupidly forgotten to deactivate from the physical building security system, to bypass the lobby and take the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. I was not wearing my standard mid-level clinical data manager uniform of plain slacks and a modest cardigan. I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a pristine, custom-tailored black blazer over a sleek charcoal dress with a hemline that fell sharply above the knee. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style, and I wore a pair of dark matte leather heels that clicked with absolute authority against the polished floor. Beside me stood Evelyn, my chief legal counsel, holding a sleek titanium briefcase containing Jackson and his signed digital confession. I glanced at the heavy gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 9:59 in the morning. The muffled voice of my stepbrother continued to leak through the solid mahogany doors. I could hear him bragging about his elite negotiation skills. I could hear him promising the board of directors that the Omnistat founder was his personal corporate ally. He was painting a beautiful, majestic portrait of his own success, entirely unaware that the canvas was currently on fire. I looked at Evelyn. She did not say a word, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a sharp, predatory smile. She adjusted her grip on the titanium briefcase and gave me a single slow nod. The digital clock in the hallway shifted. 10 o'clock exactly. I did not knock. I did not wait for a receptionist to announce my arrival. I raised my hand and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open with a forceful, smooth motion. The massive doors swung inward, hitting the internal stoppers with a loud, sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. The chief executive officer froze mid-step, his pale face locked in an expression of desperate anticipation. The board of directors held their breath, waiting to see the mysterious tech billionaire who was about to save their pharmaceutical empire. And then Jackson turned his head. I was still wearing that sickening, arrogant smirk when his eyes met mine. For one fraction of a second, his brain simply could not process the visual information. He saw the black tailored blazer. He saw the cold, absolute authority in my posture. He saw the elite corporate attorney standing silently at my shoulder. Then the horrific reality of the situation crashed into him like a physical blow. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. All the blood completely drained from his perfectly manicured features, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. His mouth fell open, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. I did not break eye contact with him as I stepped into the massive room. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, sealing the board of directors inside with their executioner. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The entire atmosphere had shifted from tense anticipation to total frozen shock. I walked slowly, deliberately toward the head of the polished table. The chief executive officer stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. "Chloe," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "What in the world are you doing in here? You were terminated on Monday. Security is supposed to keep unauthorized personnel out of the executive wing. Get out of this boardroom immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stopped at the edge of the table directly across from Jackson. My stepbrother was gripping the leather armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles were completely white. He looked as though he was struggling to breathe. I ignored the chief executive officer entirely. I kept my gaze locked onto the terrified, shaking man who had spent 32 years making my life a living nightmare. I placed my hands flat against the cool, polished mahogany, leaning forward slightly. "Good morning, Jackson," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and echoing perfectly in the silent room. "I received your desperate email last night. I am very interested to hear more about this Cayman Islands shell company you want me to wire $3 million into." The heavy mahogany doors did not simply open. They swung inward with a sudden violent force, hitting the internal stoppers with a loud, sharp crack that echoed like a massive gunshot through the completely silent boardroom. I stepped over the threshold, not as the quiet, mid-level clinical data manager they had so easily discarded on Monday morning, but as the chief executive officer of the only technology company on Earth capable of saving them from federal indictments. I was not alone. I had brought the absolute full force of my digital empire with me. Evelyn, my brilliant and entirely ruthless chief legal counsel, walked immediately to my right. She carried a sleek titanium briefcase containing the digital forensic copies of Jackson and his desperate signed confession. Behind her stepped 3 more elite corporate litigators, dressed in immaculate dark power suits and carrying thick leather portfolios. We moved into the massive executive space with absolute synchronized authority, moving like a predatory legal strike team entering a room entirely filled with cornered prey. My eyes quickly scanned the long, polished table, taking in the exact physical manifestation of corporate terror. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from tense anticipation to a heavy, suffocating shock. I looked first at this director of human resources sitting near the far end of the table. She was the exact same woman who had smugly pushed an empty cardboard box across a desk and demanded my security badge just 3 days ago. She had looked at me with such deep administrative contempt when she told me I was being terminated for poor performance. But now, as she watched me walk through those doors flanked by elite lawyers, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She instinctively pushed her rolling leather chair back from the mahogany table, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth as if she was physically trying to stifle a scream. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking violently ill. Her mind was frantically trying to calculate the catastrophic legal ramifications of having personally fired the very billionaire her company was currently begging for mercy. She tried to shrink down into her seat, desperately wishing she could become invisible. Next, my gaze shifted to the chief executive officer standing frozen at the head of the table. He was completely paralyzed. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically between my face, the tailored black blazer I was wearing, and the intimidating legal team standing at my shoulders. I could literally see the gears grinding to a halt inside his exhausted brain. He recognized my face immediately. He knew I was Chloe Evans, the sister of his vice president of compliance. But his mind simply could not reconcile the image of the disposable mid-level employee he had authorized to be fired with the untouchable visionary founder he had been desperately emailing all night long. He opened his mouth, his jaw working up and down as if he wanted to shout an order for building security, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood there entirely mute, looking exactly like an arrogant man, watching a massive tidal wave rise up and blot out the sun. But the absolute masterpiece of human psychological destruction was unfolding directly to his right. I finally locked my eyes onto Jackson. He was entirely broken. The sickening, arrogant smirk that had lived on his perfectly manicured face for 32 years was wiped away in a single devastating microsecond. It was as if I had shot him directly in the chest. He collapsed backward into his plush executive chair, completely losing control of his core muscles. The bones in his spine seemed to instantly dissolve. His expensive custom-tailored charcoal suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big, hanging loosely on a frame that was visibly shrinking from sheer panic. I watched his chest heave violently as he desperately struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. A thick layer of cold, sweaty panic instantly coated his forehead, making his perfectly styled hair look greasy and pathetic. His hands, which had been so confidently resting on the table just moments ago, were now trembling so violently that his expensive gold pen rolled away and clattered onto the floor. I knew. Looking directly into my cold, serene eyes, he realized with absolute terrifying clarity exactly what he had done. There was no anonymous corporate ally waiting to save him. There was no secret offshore kickback. There was only me, the sister he had relentlessly bullied for decades, the sister he had framed for his own incompetence, the sister whose pristine identity his parents had just stolen to pay off his massive gambling debts. I was Omnistat Solutions. I was the architect of the software that held his entire corporate survival in the balance, and I was the person he had blindly sent a fully documented federal bribery attempt just 10 hours ago. The silence in the boardroom was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. The entire board of directors watched in absolute mute bewilderment as Evelyn stepped forward. She placed the titanium briefcase softly onto the polished mahogany table. The faint metallic click of the latches opening sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The thick, expensive Persian rug completely absorbed the sharp, confident clicks of my leather heels. I stopped directly across the table from my stepbrother. He could not even look at my face anymore. His eyes were wide and glazed, staring blankly at the titanium briefcase as if it contained a live explosive. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice perfectly calm, smooth, and projecting with effortless authority across the massive room. "My name is Chloe Evans. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Omnistat Solutions." The chief executive officer let out a weak, strangulated gasp, grabbing the edge of the table to keep himself from physically collapsing. Several board members shifted violently in their seats, their faces turning completely white as the terrifying reality of the situation finally set in. I did not break eye contact with Jackson. He was hyperventilating, his shoulders shaking rapidly. "I received a very interesting email late last night." I continued, letting my words fall like heavy stones into the silent room. "Your vice president of compliance was kind enough to offer me a $3 million cash bribe in exchange for actively falsifying your federal clinical data and hiding adverse medical reactions from the government. He also provided me with the exact banking routing numbers for a shell company located in the Cayman Islands that he explicitly plans to use to launder his stolen corporate funds." A collective gasp erupted from the 12 senior partners seated around the table. It sounded exactly like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the room at once. The chief executive officer slowly turned his head to look down at Jackson. His exhausted expression morphed instantly into a look of absolute blinding rage mixed with profound corporate terror. He realized in that exact moment that the man who had just promised to save the company had actually handed the federal authorities the exact documentation needed to shut down the entire multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire. Jackson could not even speak to defend himself against the accusations. He possessed no clever lies and no arrogant deflections. He simply sat there completely paralyzed, trembling violently as the massive, crushing weight of his inevitable federal prison sentence finally landed squarely on his chest. The entire pristine, arrogant world he had built upon a foundation of lies and family exploitation had completely shattered into dust, and I was standing there perfectly calm watching the ashes fall. I walked past the paralyzed chief executive officer and approached the main digital console located at the head of the massive mahogany table. I opened my sleek silver laptop and connected the primary display cable directly into their network hub. I did not ask for permission, and nobody in the room possessed the courage to stop me. I tapped a single command on my keyboard, and the massive high-definition projection screen at the front of the boardroom flared to life. The brilliant white light illuminated the terrified, sweaty faces of the 12 senior executives sitting in the room. "There is going to be no $60 million acquisition today," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence with absolute clinical precision. "There will be no negotiation, and there is absolutely no scenario where my proprietary algorithms are deployed to mask the massive regulatory violations currently occurring on your servers. I am not here to save Ethelgard Biosciences. I am here to explain exactly why your multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire is currently burning to the ground." I pressed a key, and the first document appeared on the massive screen. It was a highly detailed forensic timeline of the internal compliance network covering the past 60 days. "Your catastrophic data. Hemorrhage was not a random software glitch," I explained, pacing slowly and deliberately across the thick Persian rug. "It was the direct result of gross negligence executed entirely by your Vice President of Compliance. The data logs clearly show that Jackson spent the last 2 months intentionally bypassing standard security protocols. He deliberately quarantined the adverse medical reactions from your Phase 3 cardiovascular trials to artificially inflate the company's stock price before the federal inspection. He dismantled his own corporate fortress because he possesses absolutely no technical understanding of the complex systems he was hired to manage." I watched the board of directors physically recoil as they read the undeniable proof of Jackson and his catastrophic incompetence. They looked at the time-stamped server logs and realized their golden boy had actively engineered their destruction. The chief executive officer gripped his hair in his hands, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray as he watched his most important drug pipeline completely evaporate on the digital screen. I pressed another key, and the projection shifted to a new document. It was the official Human Resources termination record signed and dated from Monday morning. I looked directly at the Director of Human Resources, who was currently trembling so violently in her leather chair that her teeth were visibly chattering. Instead of addressing his own massive failures, Jackson decided he desperately needed a scapegoat. I continued, my tone completely devoid of any human sympathy. He authorized my termination 3 days ago, explicitly citing poor performance and insubordination. He proudly paraded my firing to this very board as a display of his decisive leadership, and you all blindly applauded him for it. But the exact moment Human Resources deactivated my employee profile, they also instantly terminated the silent background patches I had been running for years. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of their mistake settle heavily over the room. I was the only person keeping this fragile infrastructure from completely collapsing, I said. I built a legal digital sandbox to hide his corrupted data while I tried to fix it. By firing me, your Vice President of Compliance personally pulled the digital plug on your entire corporate network. He handed you my head on a silver platter, and in doing so, he completely destroyed his own department. The Director of Human Resources burst into quiet, pathetic tears, hiding her face behind her trembling hands. She realized she had personally processed the paperwork that doomed the entire corporation. Jackson remained frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed blankly on the floor, completely unable to even look at the massive screen projecting his absolute failure. But gross incompetence and wrongful termination are merely internal corporate issues, I said, stopping my steady pace and turning to face the room. Now we move on to the federal crimes. I pressed the final key on my laptop. The massive projection screen shifted one last time. The unedited text of the desperate email Jackson had sent me the night before was now magnified to a terrifying scale. The bold black letters towered over the executives, perfectly detailing his entire criminal scheme. "This is the communication your vice president sent to my secure corporate servers just 10 hours ago," I announced, letting the heavy words hang in the cold air. Facing an immediate deadline from this board, he explicitly requested that Omnistat Solutions provide a custom digital patch to actively falsify federal health records. In exchange for this highly illegal service, he proposed a secondary $5 million consulting fee. He demanded $2 million for his own personal use and offered my firm a $3 million kickback to secure my silence. I walked back to the mahogany table and pointed firmly at the bottom of the projected email. He was even generous enough to provide the exact banking routing numbers and SWIFT codes for a specific offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands, I stated smoothly. A shell company that he currently uses to hide the corporate funds he has been actively embezzling from your compliance budget to cover his personal stock market margin calls. The boardroom completely shattered. Several senior executives began shouting at the chief executive officer, demanding immediate legal action and security intervention. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of pure corporate panic and complete financial ruin. Evelyn, my chief legal counsel, simply stood by my side holding the titanium briefcase and watching the absolute slaughter with a quiet, deeply satisfied smile. Jackson finally forced himself to look up at the massive projection screen. He stared at his own written words, his massive money laundering scheme, broadcasted for the entire world to see. He let out a low, agonizing, completely defeated moan and buried his face in his trembling hands. The entire fabricated reality he had built his entire life upon was officially permanently crushed. There was no escape, and there was absolutely no mercy left to give. The chaotic symphony of panicked voices inside the executive boardroom suddenly culminated in a massive, violent explosion of sound. The chief executive officer of Ethelgard Biosciences slammed both of his heavy fists down onto the polished mahogany table with such incredible force that the expensive crystal water pitchers physically lifted into the air and crashed back down. The deafening crack instantly silenced the shouting board members. The chief executive officer turned his entire body toward Jackson. The pale gray color of his exhausted skin was rapidly replaced by a violently angry, deep purple red. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his silk collar, looking as though they were about to physically rupture. He leaned over the table, looming over my stepbrother, like a massive apex predator about to tear its prey to absolute pieces. "You arrogant, pathetic little parasite!" the chief executive officer roared, his booming voice rattling the heavy glass windows of the boardroom. "You sat in my office and lied to my face. You stole money from this corporation to fund your own pathetic gambling addictions, and then you tried to use our emergency funds to bribe a federal witness. You have completely destroyed this entire pharmaceutical company. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting inside a federal prison cell, and I am going to personally make sure they throw away the key." Jackson could not even form a single word in his own defense. The sheer volume of the chief executive officer and the absolute crushing reality of the projected email completely broke whatever fragile pieces remained of his massive ego. His entire body began to shake uncontrollably. He looked up at the towering, angry executives surrounding him and realized that his manufactured charm and his tailored suits meant absolutely nothing anymore. He was a dead man walking. His legs simply gave out. Jackson slipped entirely out of his plush leather executive chair. He did not fall gracefully. He collapsed into a pathetic heap on the floor, his knees hitting the thick, expensive Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud. The vice president of compliance, a man who had spent his entire life looking down on everyone around him, was now literally crawling on the floor of his own corporate boardroom. He scrambled frantically across the carpet, moving directly toward where I was standing. He completely ignored the furious chief executive officer and the disgusted board of directors. He stopped right at the tips of my matte leather heels and looked up at me. His face was an absolute mask of pure human desperation. The expensive styling product in his hair had completely failed, leaving his sweaty, greasy locks plastered flat against his forehead. Heavy, thick tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the cold sweat and dripping off his chin onto his crisp white silk shirt. He reached out with his trembling hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my tailored black blazer. "Chloe," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Chloe, please, you have to stop this. You have to take that email off the screen right now. Please just hit delete. Just wipe the server and pretend this never happened." I did not step back. I did not try to pull my blazer out of his desperate, frantic grip. I simply stood there looking down at him with the exact same clinical detachment I would use to analyze a faulty string of basic computer code. "We are family," Chloe Jackson pleaded, his entire body heaving with violent sobs. "I am your brother. You cannot do this to your own family. Mom and Dad will never survive this. If you give that email to the federal government, they will arrest me. They will take away everything I have. They will take the townhouse and the cars, and Maya will leave me. I will have absolutely nothing." He squeezed his eyes shut, and fresh tears poured down his red, swollen cheeks. "Just take the $60 million, Chloe," he begged desperately. "Take the money and fix the servers. You will be incredibly rich. You can walk away today a multimillionaire, and I promise you will never have to see me again. I will resign. I will disappear. Just please do not let them put me in a federal cage. I am begging you. I am literally begging for my life." The 12 senior partners of the pharmaceutical company watched the pathetic display in absolute stunned silence. They were witnessing the total psychological destruction of a man they had previously trusted with their most secure corporate secrets. The chief executive officer stood breathing heavily, his fists still clenched tight, watching my stepbrother cry like a terrified child. I looked down at Jackson and felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering sense of sibling loyalty. There was no pity for his pathetic tears. I remembered the exact way he looked at me in the parking lot when he threw my personal belongings onto the wet hood of my car. I remembered the sickening smirk on his face at the luxury steakhouse while our parents secretly ruined my financial future to pay for his massive hidden debts. He did not care about family when he was stealing my identity. He only cared about family now because he was desperately trying to use the concept as a shield to protect himself from his own criminal actions. I reached down and calmly peeled his trembling, sweaty fingers off the fabric of my tailored blazer. He let out a loud, agonizing gasp as I broke his physical connection to me. I took one single deliberate step backward out of his reach. I turned my attention away from the pathetic crying man on the floor and looked directly at the chief executive officer. "Omnistat Solutions is officially declining your acquisition offer," I stated, my voice echoing with perfect absolute authority across the silent boardroom. "I will not accept $60 million to cover up your massive regulatory violations. I will not deploy my proprietary software to save this corporation, and I will absolutely not delete a single piece of verified evidence." I walked calmly over to the main digital console. I placed my hands on my sleek silver laptop. I did not look back at Jackson. I pushed the screen down. The laptop closed with a sharp, decisive click. The massive projection screen at the front of the boardroom instantly went completely black, plunging the room back into the heavy natural shadows of the morning sun. "No," Jackson screamed from the floor, his voice echoing with absolute raw terror. "No, Chloe, you cannot do this. You have to help me." I picked up my laptop and tucked it smoothly under my arm. Evelyn stepped forward, standing firmly by my side with the titanium briefcase securely in her grip. "There is nothing left to help Jackson," I said, looking down at him one final time. "You seem to be under the extremely foolish impression that I brought this digital evidence here today as a negotiation tactic. I did not come here to negotiate your surrender. I came here to personally witness your execution." I gestured slightly toward Evelyn and her titanium briefcase. "My chief legal counsel did not just archive your desperate bribery attempt last night," I explained, watching the last remaining shred of hope completely die in his eyes. At precisely 8 o'clock this morning, Evelyn transmitted the completely unedited server logs, your signed digital confession, and the exact international banking codes for your offshore shell company directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We also provided a comprehensive duplicate file to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The chief executive officer let out a low, horrified groan and sank slowly into his leather chair, resting his head in his hands. The board of directors realized simultaneously that the federal authorities were already fully mobilized. The massive corporate raid was not a distant threat anymore. It was an absolute, immediate certainty. "The federal agents are not preparing an investigation, Jackson," I said, my voice perfectly flat and cold. "They already have the complete forensic blueprint of your entire criminal enterprise. They are currently pulling the warrants for your townhouse, your personal bank accounts, and this exact corporate building. They will be walking through the front lobby doors downstairs in less than 20 minutes. Jackson let out a sound that was completely devoid of human dignity. It was a hollow, empty wail of pure, absolute defeat. He curled into a tight fetal position on the thick Persian rug, wrapping his arms around his own head and weeping uncontrollably into the carpet. I turned away from the destruction I had perfectly engineered. I had completely dismantled his career, his fabricated wealth, and his entire future in less than 3 days. I walked purposefully toward the heavy mahogany doors, the sharp clicks of my matte leather heels echoing against the floor. Evelyn and the rest of my elite legal team followed silently, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate power behind me. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked out into the quiet, carpeted hallway, leaving Jackson and the burning ruins of his pharmaceutical empire entirely behind me. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me with a solid, resounding thud. That single sound felt like a massive iron vault sealing shut on the first 32 years of my life. The chaotic, muffled shouts of the furious chief executive officer and the pathetic, agonizing sobs of my stepbrother were instantly cut off. The carpeted executive hallway was completely silent. Evelyn walked perfectly in step beside me. She did not say a single word, but I could feel the intense radiation of her professional satisfaction. We did not wait for the standard elevator. I swiped my active access card one final time against the security panel of the private executive lift. The brushed steel doors slid open immediately. My elite legal team stepped inside and I followed, pressing the button for the main ground floor lobby. The descent was incredibly fast and perfectly smooth. I watched the digital floor indicator flash the numbers counting down the remaining seconds I would ever have to spend inside this toxic corporate environment. There was no adrenaline left in my system. There was no lingering anger, and there was absolutely no sadness. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The massive, invisible weight of my family and their relentless psychological manipulation had simply vanished into nothing. The elevator arrived at the ground floor with a soft, polite chime. The steel doors parted, revealing the sprawling, immaculate marble lobby of the Ethelgard Biosciences headquarters. The morning sunlight poured through the massive glass facade, reflecting brilliantly off the polished stone floor. But the lobby was no longer a quiet, pristine space of corporate intimidation. The massive revolving glass doors at the front entrance were currently spinning with violent, urgent momentum. A literal army of federal authority was pouring into the building. Dozens of men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters printed across their backs were sweeping into the corporate sanctuary. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Food and Drug Administration had arrived in perfect unison, just as Evelyn had coordinated. The building security guards, the exact same men who had smugly watched me carry my cardboard box out of this lobby on Monday, were completely paralyzed. They stood frozen behind their curved marble desk, their hands raised slightly in the air, entirely helpless as the federal agents quickly seized control of the security terminals and locked down the building perimeter. I walked forward, my matte leather heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. My legal team formed a perfect wedge around me, parting the sea of panicked corporate employees who were scattering desperately out of the way. A senior federal agent leading the primary arrest team spotted us approaching. He held a thick stack of authorized warrants in his right hand. He looked at the tailored black blazer I was wearing and the titanium briefcase securely gripped in Evelyn's hand. He did not attempt to stop us or ask for our identification. He simply offered a tight, respectful nod, recognizing the exact legal counsel that had just handed his agency the easiest federal prosecution of his entire career. I did not stop to speak to him. I did not look back at the private executive elevator that was currently being locked down by two armed agents preparing to ascend to the top floor to put Jackson in handcuffs. I simply kept walking. I walked right past the federal task force, right past the paralyzed security guards, and right through the spinning glass doors. I stepped out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. The crisp morning air filled my lungs. The sounds of the city, the honking yellow taxis, and the rush of pedestrians felt incredibly vibrant and alive. Behind me, inside the towering glass fortress, a spoiled, arrogant man was about to be dragged out in front of the entire world. His parents would soon face immediate financial ruin and federal fraud charges for their stolen mortgage loan. Their entire toxic kingdom of lies was actively crumbling to dust. But I was not looking behind me anymore. I adjusted my coat, looked out at the endless bright skyline of the city, and took a slow, deep breath. My schedule was completely clear, and I had a multi-billion-dollar technology empire to run. I stepped off the curb and vanished into the massive, brilliant momentum of the city. The financial fallout of Ethelgard Biosciences was absolute and immediate. By noon on Friday, the catastrophic collapse of the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire was dominating the front page of every major financial news outlet in the world. The Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg ran massive headline stories detailing the unprecedented federal raid. The pristine corporate image the chief executive officer had ruthlessly maintained was completely shattered in a matter of hours. As the market opened, the company's stock price went into a violent, uncontrolled freefall. Investors panicked and liquidated their shares in massive, uncoordinated waves, completely vaporizing billions of dollars in corporate valuation before the trading floor even closed for the weekend. And directly at the center of the massive financial crater was Jackson. The news networks played the video footage of his arrest on a continuous, merciless loop. It was captured by a dozen different press cameras stationed outside the Manhattan headquarters. The footage showed my arrogant stepbrother being physically escorted out of the spinning glass doors by two armed federal agents. He was not wearing his custom-tailored charcoal jacket. His hands were firmly secured behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled, greasy mess, and his face was buried deep in his chest, desperately trying to hide from the blinding flashes of the press cameras. He looked incredibly small, utterly pathetic, and entirely broken. The Department of Justice did not waste a single moment processing his destruction, because Evelyn had handed them a complete digitally verified forensic blueprint of his criminal enterprise. The federal prosecutors did not even need to negotiate a plea deal. They filed a massive, devastating list of formal indictments against him before the sun even set on Friday. Jackson Pierce was officially charged with multiple counts of severe securities fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the attempted bribery of a private corporate entity. The presiding federal judge looked at the undeniable mountain of digital evidence, including the exact banking routing numbers for his offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, and immediately designated him as a massive flight risk. He was completely denied bail. The arrogant vice president of compliance, who had spent his entire life sleeping on high thread count sheets and dining at luxury steakhouses, was remanded directly into a cold concrete federal holding cell. His elite defense attorneys informed him that the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for his combined crimes practically guaranteed he would spend the next 15 years of his life rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The reality of his absolute destruction triggered a rapid and utterly predictable chain reaction within his own fabricated life. Maya did not stand by her husband. She did not hire a legal team to fight for his freedom, and she certainly did not visit him in the federal detention center. The very moment the news broke and the federal agents froze all of his personal financial assets, Maya realized the money and the prestige were permanently gone. She filed for an expedited divorce before the weekend was even over. She immediately packed all of her expensive designer clothing and her massive diamond ring into a set of luxury suitcases and completely abandoned their expensive townhouse. She left him to face the total collapse of his life entirely alone, proving exactly what I had always known. Their marriage was nothing more than a shallow transaction built entirely on the illusion of wealth, and the moment the wealth evaporated, she vanished without a single trace of loyalty or remorse. But Jackson was not the only member of my toxic family facing the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. The massive financial snare I had engineered for my parents was closing rapidly around them. When I initiated the total credit freeze on Wednesday night, the National Bank automatically red-flagged the $400,000 commercial loan they had fraudulently secured in my name. The sudden reversal of those massive funds triggered an immediate high-priority institutional investigation. The banking investigators easily traced the fraudulent digital signatures and the forged underwriting documents directly back to the legacy joint checking account controlled by Richard and Susan. They did not even have the technical competence to hide their digital footprints. The bank immediately handed the entire dossier over to the federal authorities. On Monday morning, just 3 days after Jackson was arrested, a caravan of dark federal vehicles pulled into the quiet, pristine driveway of my parents' sprawling suburban mansion. My mother and stepfather were completely blindsided. They had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to contact Jackson and furiously calling my blocked cell phone number, demanding to know what was happening. They genuinely believed they were completely safe, hidden away in their wealthy suburban bubble. They were violently pulled out of that delusion when armed federal agents knocked on their heavy oak front door with formal arrest warrants. Richard and Susan were both formally indicted for severe identity theft and massive commercial wire fraud. The social and financial destruction of my parents was an absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. The federal government immediately froze every single asset they owned. Their bank accounts, their retirement portfolios, and their equity lines were completely locked down, pending the massive criminal investigation. They were suddenly entirely stripped of the wealth they had weaponized against me for my entire life. But for my mother, the true punishment was the absolute public humiliation. The news of their arrest spread like a rapid wildfire through their elite suburban social circle. By Tuesday morning, they were completely exiled from their exclusive country club. Their wealthy friends, the same people Susan had spent decades desperately trying to impress, instantly stopped returning their phone calls. They became complete social pariahs overnight, branded as desperate criminals who had stolen their own daughter identity to cover up a massive corporate scandal. They were forced to surrender their passports, and they were placed under strict federal house arrest while awaiting their criminal trial. They were trapped inside their massive empty house with no money, no social status, and the absolute terrifying reality that they would likely spend the last years of their lives wearing standard-issue prison uniforms. I watched the entire collapse from the total quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. I sat in my expansive living room holding a warm cup of coffee and looking out over the magnificent Manhattan skyline. My massive multi-monitor workstation was powered down for the day. Omnistat Solutions was stronger than ever, completely untouched by the radioactive fallout of Ethelgard Biosciences. My phone had been ringing continuously for days, filled with frantic voicemails from Richard begging me to call the bank and drop the fraud charges. He pleaded with me, crying into the receiver, telling me that they were my family and that I owed them my forgiveness. Susan had left a dozen messages oscillating wildly between desperate sobbing apologies and furious toxic demands. I did not listen to a single one of them. I simply pressed delete. They had spent 32 years treating me like an inferior disposable asset. They had emotionally manipulated me, belittled my career, and actively tried to destroy my future just to protect a man who ended up destroying himself. They had placed all their bets on my silent compliance, and they had lost everything. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the gentle warmth spread through my chest. The air in my penthouse was perfectly still and incredibly peaceful. There was no more screaming. There were no more cruel family dinners. There was absolutely nothing left holding me back. The revenge was completely final, and for the very first time in my entire life, the future belonged entirely to me. The financial collapse of Ethelgard Biosciences was only the beginning of the absolute destruction. The shockwave of Jackson and his federal indictment shattered the fragile illusion of wealth that my family had spent decades carefully constructing. The very first casualty of the bankruptcy was his marriage. Maya did not hesitate for a single second. The moment the news networks broadcasted the federal raid and the government froze their personal bank accounts, she understood that the money was permanently gone. There was no loyalty, and there was no love. She filed for an expedited divorce before Jackson even spent his second night in a federal holding cell. She packed all of her expensive designer clothing, her jewelry, and her massive diamond ring into a set of luxury suitcases. She completely abandoned their expensive townhouse and fled the city, desperate to protect her own social reputation from the toxic fallout of his criminal trial. But the absolute masterpiece of financial justice was unfolding in the pristine suburbs. When I initiated the total credit freeze on Wednesday night, the national banking system automatically flagged the $400,000 commercial loan my parents had fraudulently secured in my name. The sudden massive reversal of those funds triggered a high-priority institutional investigation. The bank forensic accountants easily traced the forged digital signatures and the fraudulent underwriting documents directly back to the legacy joint checking account controlled by Richard and Susan. The consequences were devastating and immediate. The bank instantly froze every single financial asset they owned. Their retirement portfolios, their savings accounts, and their equity lines were completely locked down. The federal authorities launched a massive criminal investigation into their deliberate identity theft. Because the fraudulent loan was secured using their sprawling suburban mansion as collateral, the bank immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. Within a matter of days, the massive, luxurious house they had used to project their false superiority was officially confiscated by the bank. They were completely stripped of the wealth they had weaponized against me my entire life. The absolute finality of their destruction culminated on a bitterly cold Tuesday evening. I was stepping out of the warm, luxurious lobby of my secure Manhattan residential building. The sky was dark, and a heavy freezing snow was falling rapidly, blanketing the city streets in a thick layer of white. As the heavy glass doors of the lobby slid shut behind me, I saw them. Richard and Susan were standing on the freezing concrete sidewalk just beyond the protective perimeter of my building security. They looked completely unrecognizable. They were not wearing their pristine country club attire. They looked exhausted, entirely defeated, and physically broken by the crushing weight of their sudden poverty. The heavy snow was gathering on their coats, and they were shivering violently in the freezing wind. They had clearly been waiting out in the freezing cold for hours, entirely unable to bypass the strict security desk inside. When Susan saw me walking down the steps, she let out a loud, desperate sob. She stumbled forward through the heavy snow, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. Richard followed closely behind her. His shoulders hunched, his face pale and completely hollow. "Chloe," she cried out, her voice cracking painfully in the freezing air. "Chloe, please, you have to help us." I stopped at the edge of the private awning, completely shielded from the falling snow. I looked at the two people who had spent 32 years treating me like a disposable asset. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left, and there was certainly no pity. "They took my house, Chloe." Susan sobbed uncontrollably, tears freezing on her pale cheeks. "The bank took absolutely everything. We have no money. We have nowhere to go. They are threatening to put us in federal prison. You are incredibly wealthy now. You have to save us. We are your family. You cannot just leave us out here in the cold." Richard stood beside her, his massive ego completely crushed. He looked down at the snow-covered sidewalk, unable to even meet my eyes. "Please, Chloe," he mumbled, his voice weak and pathetic. "We made a terrible mistake. We are so incredibly sorry. Just pay the bank. Pay the $400,000 and make the criminal charges go away. It is practically nothing to you now. Please just give us another chance." I stood in the warm, ambient light of my building, completely untouched by the freezing storm. I looked at my mother sobbing in the snow and my stepfather begging for a financial bailout. They were not apologizing for a lifetime of emotional abuse. They were not sorry for stealing my identity or destroying my credit. They were only apologizing because they had finally been caught, and they wanted a billionaire to pay for their crimes. I pulled my heavy wool coat a little tighter around my shoulders. "You made your absolute choice at the luxury steakhouse," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion, cutting clearly through the howling wind. "You chose to sacrifice my future to fund a criminal. Now you are experiencing the exact reality of that choice." Susan let out a horrific, agonizing wail and fell to her knees in the freezing snow. She grabbed the edge of my coat, pleading and screaming for mercy. Richard reached down desperately, trying to pull her back to her feet, but he was too weak and entirely defeated. I calmly stepped back, pulling my coat free from her frantic, freezing grip. "Do not ever come to this building again," I stated, looking down at them one final time. "You are completely, entirely on your own." I turned my back to them and walked toward the sleek black town car that was waiting for me at the curb. I did not look back as the driver opened the door. I slid into the warm, quiet leather interior. The heavy door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, instantly silencing their pathetic cries. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the bright, busy traffic of the city, leaving the remnants of my toxic family completely behind in the cold and the dark. I looked down at the two pathetic figures shivering in the freezing snow. They were weeping openly, their tears freezing onto their pale, desperate faces. Susan was still reaching out her frozen fingers, desperately clawing at the empty air where I had been standing just a moment before. Richard was completely broken, his head bowed in absolute defeat against the bitter winter wind. They expected a negotiation. They expected the quiet, compliant daughter they had completely walked over for 3 decades to suddenly reappear and save them from the exact consequences of their own horrific actions. I took a slow, deep breath of the freezing winter air. It felt incredibly sharp and perfectly clean in my lungs. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, and I did not blink. "You all taught me a very important lesson about loyalty," I said, my voice perfectly steady and slicing through the howling wind with absolute precision. "You taught me that it is entirely transactional. Now I only have one single priority in this world, and it is absolutely not this family." I did not wait to watch the final devastating realization wash over their freezing faces. I did not give them another single second of my time. I simply stepped right past them, my matte leather heels leaving sharp, precise footprints in the fresh snow. I walked directly toward the sleek black town car idling at the curb. The heavy tinted windows shielded the warm, quiet interior from the bitter winter storm. The professional driver immediately opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the rich leather seat, leaning back into the absolute quiet sanctuary of my new life. The driver closed the door with a solid, heavy thud, instantly cutting off the pathetic wailing sounds of my mother on the sidewalk. I looked out the tinted window one final time as the powerful vehicle engaged. They looked incredibly small, kneeling together in the dark, freezing snow, entirely abandoned by the daughter they had tried to destroy. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the bright, endless momentum of the Manhattan night. I did not look back again. The past was completely erased, the revenge was definitively finished, and my empire was just beginning. Exactly 1 year later, the atmosphere inside my private cliffside mansion was entirely different from the cold corporate boardrooms and the freezing winter sidewalks of my past. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the shimmering dark ocean, reflecting the soft, warm light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above my dining room table. There was no tension in the air tonight. There was no anxiety, and there were absolutely no lies. Soft jazz music played quietly through the hidden speakers, weaving perfectly with the distant sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks far below. The massive stone fireplace cast a comforting glow across the rich hardwood floors, creating a space that felt incredibly safe and completely secure. I sat at the head of the long oak table, looking down at the small, carefully selected group of people gathered in my home. We were sharing a magnificent multi-course meal prepared by a private chef, but the luxury of the food was secondary to the absolute warmth of the company. There were only 6 of us at the table, but they represented the absolute core of my new life. Evelyn sat to my right, holding a glass of vintage red wine and laughing warmly at a brilliant story being told by my lead software architect. Beside them sat the new chief medical officer of my company and my primary financial strategist. These were not disposable corporate assets, and they were certainly not toxic relatives, desperately looking for a financial bailout. These were brilliant, loyal, and fiercely protective individuals. They were the family I had actively chosen to build for myself. I listened to the joyful sound of their conversation and let my shoulders completely relax. For 32 years, my entire existence had been defined by the suffocating weight of my biological family. I had spent decades trying to shrink myself down to fit into their miserable, arrogant world. I remembered the agonizing holiday dinners where I was treated like a silent servant while Jackson boasted about his fabricated achievements. I remembered the constant crushing pressure to quietly absorb their abuse just to keep the fragile peace. All of that felt like a distant, fading nightmare now. Omnistat Solutions had recently closed its second public offering, officially making it the most powerful medical data analytics firm on the planet. I had completely stopped checking the news articles months ago. I did not care that Jackson was currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal prison cell, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, facing another 14 years of absolute isolation. I did not care that my parents were living in a tiny government-subsidized apartment, entirely exiled from their wealthy social circles and permanently banned from the traditional banking system. They had completely ceased to exist in my daily reality. They were no longer towering monsters or terrifying antagonists hiding in the shadows of my life. They had simply been reduced to insignificant grains of dust, blowing aimlessly in the wind, far outside the impenetrable walls of my digital empire. I did not wish them any further harm because I simply did not think about them at all. Evelyn turned to me and gently raised her crystal wine glass. The bright firelight caught the deep red liquid, making it glow beautifully in the dim room. She smiled a genuine, soft smile that was entirely different from the predatory legal grin she wore during our corporate executions. "To Chloe," she said, her voice clear and completely sincere. "To the most brilliant visionary I have ever known, and to a beautiful future that belongs entirely to us." The rest of the table immediately raised their glasses, echoing the quiet, respectful toast. I smiled back at her and gently raised my own glass. "Thank you, Evelyn," I replied, my voice steady and filled with absolute peace. I took a slow sip of the rich wine, letting the warmth settle deep into my chest. There was a time when I thought the ultimate victory would be watching my enemies suffer. I thought the raw anger would sustain me forever. But standing here in this beautiful house surrounded by people who genuinely value my mind and my spirit, I finally understood the absolute truth. The most powerful revenge in the world is not anger. Anger requires you to hold on to the people who hurt you. Anger forces you to keep their toxic memories alive in your heart. The sweetest and most absolute revenge is a success so massive and so blindingly bright that it completely erases them from your timeline. It is building a life so incredibly beautiful that the people who actively tried to bury you are no longer even worthy of your memory. I set my glass down on the table and looked out the massive glass window toward the endless dark ocean. The horizon was completely clear. My mind was finally quiet. I turned back to my chosen family, listening to their laughter fill the warm, bright room. I was no longer a disposable employee, and I was no longer a victim. I was completely, utterly, and permanently free.